Back in 2017, I was 25 and I was actually laying low in a completely isolated, dusty stretch of Ector County in Texas. I had an active warrant for a probation violation at the time, which meant that reaching out to the law for help was totally out of the question, no matter how terrifying things got. Now, I was staying in a converted metal workshop at the very end of a long, unlit dirt road with a sketchy guy that I was splitting a salvage gig with. Our dynamic was incredibly volatile too. Massive screaming matches that usually ended with him jumping into our only Jeep and tearing off in it, leaving me completely stranded. And to make things worse, the property was in a massive dead zone. If you wanted enough signal to send a text or even make a call, you had to physically walk over a mile down the dirt track to the main state highway intersection just to get a signal. And one Thursday night at around midnight, we had an absolute blowout. I locked myself in the back tool room to cool off, and when I finally came out, the Jeep was gone again. My phone was completely useless inside of the metal building, and I was so furious and wound up that I decided to just hoof it down the dark dirt road to the highway, figuring that he'd just be sitting in the driver's seat at the intersection where the reception finally kicked in. When I hit the asphalt at the edge of the highway, the road was completely dead though, no Jeep. I was totally on my own, surrounded by miles of flat empty brush and old oil fields. I started walking south along the shoulder toward a 24-hour truck stop that was another mile down the road, opening my phone and trying to call his number over and over as the bars finally popped up. About 10 minutes into the walk, a beat-up white box truck rattled past me, and a block down, its brake lights flared up, and the driver pulled hard onto the gravel shoulder. The engine just sat there, idling for a bit. I couldn't see anything through the back because it was a solid metal cargo wall, but suddenly the driver's side door swung wide open. My skin instantly went cold for some reason too, and I stopped dead in the dark. But right then, a pair of headlights topped the distant hill coming toward us. The driver of the box truck immediately slammed his door shut, hit the gas and tore off down the road. I tried to convince myself that it was just some guy pulling over to check his map or something. 5 minutes later, I heard the heavy, loose clanking of a bad exhaust behind me. I turned around. The white truck was coming back, but this time it had crossed completely over the center line and was crawling toward me on my side of the road, its high beams totally blinding me. The side windows were tinted pitch black, and as it rolled past at a literal walking pace, I noticed something deeply unsettling about the cargo box. Someone had cruelly cut a series of narrow vertical ventilation grates straight into the metal side panels, and in the glare of the dashboard light, I could see thick iron bars welded against the inside of the openings. Another random car rounded the bend, and the white truck immediately gunned it, fishtailing out and then vanishing. I had a horrible feeling in my gut at that point, though. I turned right around and started making a break back toward my dirt road, and sure enough, here comes that clanking exhaust again. The truck passed me, slammed on its brakes 100 yards ahead, and pulled over. In the red glow of the taillights, I got a much better look at the back this time. It had a heavy padlock iron bar running completely across the rear roll-up door, locking it from the outside, it seemed. The driver's door popped open again, just a few inches. The guy inside was sitting there, waiting for me to walk up into the shadows. And like clockwork, the rumble of an oncoming semi-truck echoed down the road, and the white truck pulled its door shut and sped away again. My roommate still isn't answering any of my texts. I finally got near the mouth of the private dirt road that led back to the workshop, but right then, I saw the white truck making a U-turn under a distant oil rig light. I deliberately walked right past my turnoff and kept going straight down the highway. I knew the second that I turned into that private dirt road, I would lose my signal completely and there would be absolutely zero traffic to scare this guy off. I pulled my phone out, held it flat against my chest, and started snapping frantic, blurry photos of the truck as it came back around. I texted the pictures to my best friend in Austin with the message, "If I don't check in tomorrow, show the cops this truck." The truck accelerated past me again, probably because the driver saw the glowing screen. I used that small window of time to call my friend. I told him to stay on the line with me no matter what, explaining that some freak in a modified box truck was stalking me on the highway. I turned back around and I ran for the hidden dirt road, thinking the phone had finally spooked him. The exact second that my boots hit the dirt incline, the white truck roared back around to the highway bend. I didn't think. I just sprinted up the steep dirt hill faster than I ever have in my life, veering straight off the path and diving headfirst into a thick patch of mesquite brush and cacti. From the shadows, I watched the yellow headlights of the truck slowly roll past my hiding spot, continuing straight up the road toward our workshop. I kept moving through the dark brush, tracking the road by the glow of his headlights. The night was dead silent, except for the old engine. I heard him turning around in our gravel yard before I even saw him, too. I threw myself down behind a rusted piece of old machinery, pressing myself into the dirt. The white truck crept back down the hill, going about 5 miles an hour. The driver's side window was completely rolled down now, though I couldn't make out a face in the pitch black. Once the red taillights faded down the hill, I scrambled out of the brush and made a frantic break for the metal barn. But the noise, it returned. He was coming back again. It turned into a horrific game of hide-and-seek, and I spent the next half an hour ducking behind neighbors' rusted chain-link fences, squeezing between broken-down car parts and junkyards, and crawling through the ditches every time those headlights swept across the dirt road. I finally slipped through the back door of the workshop, though, drenched in sweat and shaking so hard that I could barely breathe. My roommate, he still wasn't home, though. I sat on the concrete floor with the lights off, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my friend talk to me from about 2 hours away. For the next 3 hours, too, every 20 to 25 minutes, like clockwork, I would hear that distinct rattling exhaust pipe laboring back up the dirt hill. The guy was completely relentless, circling that dead-end road over and over in the dark, looking for where I had vanished. My friend finally arrived at the property around 4 in the morning, after driving like an absolute maniac from the city, apparently. My roommate, though, didn't roll back into the yard until nearly 5:30 in the morning, completely oblivious, only checking his phone after the sun had started coming up. I packed my bags and I left that property 3 days later and never went back to that county. I don't know who that man was or who he was planning to lock behind those iron bars, but knowing that I couldn't call for help made that night the most helpless and terrifying experience of my life. I'm not naturally a nervous person by any means. Back when I was a teenager, I even used to hitchhike around the outskirts of Seattle at 3 in the morning and never felt a single bit of anxiety. I've been in rough situations and usually I keep a completely level head. But a few years ago, I had an encounter that made me realize that your instincts will absolutely scream at you when something is genuinely wrong. This happened back in November of 2018. I was 23 at the time, living in a tiny depressing blip of a town in eastern Oregon. The main feature of the area was a massive state penitentiary, located just down the highway in fact, so the whole town always had this weird sort of lockdown energy to it. My car had been broken into and totaled by joyriders the week before, so I was desperately looking for a cheap replacement on OfferUp. I found an old Chevy truck for $900 cash, but I didn't have a ride to a bank, so my only option was to walk to the 24-hour Chevron station, about a half a mile away, to hit the ATM. It was a Tuesday night, well past 11, and the streets were totally deserted. The walk was incredibly unsettling too. The sidewalk was lined with these massive, thick bramble bushes, and the shadows were playing tricks on my eyes a bit. I had this intense crawling sensation on the back of my neck like I was being tracked as well, so I actually stepped off the curb and started walking right down the center of the asphalt, just to keep 20 feet of open space between myself and the hedges. I eventually made it to the gas station though, used the machine to pull out my daily limit of $500, and then had to awkwardly hang around the chip aisle until midnight passed so the system would reset and let me draw the $400 that I needed. Once I had the cash hidden in my boot though, I grabbed a soda and I started the trek back home. I was nearing the same dark stretch of overgrown bushes when a shape appeared under the far streetlight, walking in my direction. As the distance closed between us, my brain struggled to process what I was actually looking at. The guy was huge, at least 6'4", broad-shouldered and wearing a heavy canvas duster coat. But his face was completely covered by a vintage rubber military gas mask with those massive insect-like glass lenses and the heavy filter snout sticking out of the jaw. Every single alarm bell in my head went off. My breath caught in my throat and my legs felt heavy. I immediately drifted across the street, putting the entire width of the road between us, my eyes practically glued to this guy. He didn't even acknowledge me though. He kept his head completely locked straight ahead, his arms hanging totally limp at his sides, just marching at a steady, rhythmic pace down the opposite sidewalk. The only sound in the entire neighborhood was the sort of wet, metallic hiss or click of his breath passing through the rubber valves of the mask that he was wearing. It was the most unnatural thing that I have ever really witnessed. Anyway, we passed each other and I kept walking for about another block, but the silence behind me was way too loud. I had this desperate, frantic need to know where he was, I think, and so I stopped and looked back over my shoulder. The guy, he had spun around on his heel and was standing dead still in the middle of the empty street. He was completely rigid, arms pinned to his sides, just staring through those hollow glass goggles directly at me. He looked like a mannequin dropped in the middle of the road. My brain then just cleared out all logic. I didn't care how stupid I looked. I turned and I ran the remaining 2 blocks to my house at a full sprint, practically throwing my weight against the front door to lock it behind me. But the real panic set in about an hour later, long after I'd locked myself inside. You see, I was sitting in my living room floor trying to calm down when my phone completely lost its network connection. And at that exact same second, the old analog battery-powered clock on my wall began ticking sort of backward, the hands jerking erratically against the glass and behaving really weirdly. Suddenly, a massive localized physical vibration hit the front of the house, it seemed. It wasn't an earthquake. It was entirely focused on the front porch. The heavy double-paned glass of my living room window violently fixed inward, moving and shaking from this frequency. I crept toward the blinds and peeked out. The street lamp outside was completely dead, but in the ambient moonlight, I could see that the large gravel driveway had been violently disturbed. A deep, perfect, straight 5-inch trench had been sort of plowed directly through the stone and packed dirt, starting from the edge of the asphalt and cutting straight up to my concrete porch steps. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, and no discarded tools. Something huge, though, had been dragged right to my door, and I didn't know what it was. Look, I'm not saying that it was the local edgelord that I saw earlier, trying to get a reaction out of people on a boring weeknight or anything, but the whole thing does seem really coincidental, doesn't it? Anyway, I actually bought the truck the next morning, and I never walked that stretch of road ever again. I'm actually sharing this from a sleeping bag on the floor of my uncle's basement right now because I'm completely terrified and, quite honestly, a little bit disappointed with myself. I made some incredibly stupid choices over the last few days, but I was so broke and stressed out about getting evicted that my brain just stopped working right. I needed cash fast, and that desperation made me the perfect target for a freak who knew exactly how to play me. This whole mess started about a week ago. I'm 24 and I live in a small apartment in Pennsylvania. I was digging through a local community board, looking for a quick side hustle when this guy messaged me out of nowhere. He offered me a quick, remote gig doing online property layout checks that paid about $60 a day. He sounded totally normal in his text messages, so we set up a video call to go over how it worked. The second, though, that the camera connected, the whole vibe got completely weird. He was sitting in the dark inside of what looked like a concrete storage unit. I could see the metallic lines of a rolling garage door right behind him, and his voice had this heavy, sort of muffled quality to it. Before we did any actual layout work, he told me that he needed to test my spatial awareness and compliance under pressure. He told me to grab a thick black Sharpie, go over to my bedroom wall, and start defacing my own personal photos and calendars, drawing big X's over the faces while staying on the camera. He kept calling it a focus drill, asking me after every single mark, does the room feel bigger now or smaller? I know how completely brainless that sounds, but last winter, some random person on a gig app paid me $200 just to film myself organizing a toolbox in alphabetical order for some weird student art film. So my brain just rationalized this as another eccentric internet thing. I avoided marking up anything irreplaceable, but the whole thing felt incredibly wrong, and this heavy, sort of sickening feeling started crawling up my spine. While I was drawing on the wall, his camera angle shifted slightly, and I saw that the floor of his space was completely covered in stacks of handwritten notebooks, with printed out social media photos of local college students taped to the covers or something like that. He was sitting there dead-eyeing me through the screen, though, completely motionless. Eventually, I started moving too slow because I was getting so sketched out, and the second that I paused, his tone completely flipped. He barked at me to grow up, told me that I blew the assignment, and slammed the call shut. The next morning, though, is when things got really bad. You see, he started texting my phone like nothing had happened, trying to chat casually. He brought up local spots right near me, like the Unimart down the hill, and then he brought up the old concrete coal breakers out in the woods. If you're not from this part of Pennsylvania, then you probably wouldn't know, but those abandoned structures are notorious for being dangerous places where even some bodies have been dumped over the years. And it is right down the road from my apartment, unfortunately. Now, I realized with absolute certainty that this was not a job. It was a predator who had just spent an hour recording me on a video. I had stupidly given him way too much information during our initial chat, including the fact that my parents live right behind the old brick diner on Route 11. My parents actually left last week for a long trip too, so their house is completely empty right now, which makes this whole thing even worse, but he started hounding me to meet up in person, saying that we could take a drive out by the railroad tracks, or he could just drop me by my place since he lived just around the corner anyway. I've blocked him on everything and deleted my accounts, but I haven't slept in like 2 days either. Every time that a car slows down outside of my uncle's house, my chest tightens up so bad that I can barely breathe. And really, I just sort of need to know how easily someone could track me down within my neighborhood, and what practical steps I could take to completely drop off this guy's radar. Some people talk about having an internal alarm system for dangerous situations, but you never really realize just how violent that physical reaction is until your chest completely tightens up for you. I'm 24 now, and this went down about 6 months back, but I still cannot shake just how fast a routine, exhausting shift turned into something that felt like a straight-up fight for survival. So, my cousin and I were working a brutal graveyard run, clearing out junk from a massive multi-level public storage facility in downtown Missouri. It was around 2 a.m, and we were completely dead on our feet, covered in sweat and operating on a massive delay, If you've ever had to haul heavy scrap down those narrow concrete corridors in the dead of the night, then you know that the basement units are a total mess of tight corners and bad lighting. But to get a breather from the stuffy air, we stepped out onto the open-air loading dock at the back of the building because a cool breeze was coming through the alley. It was a crisp, clear night, and the fresh air actually felt incredible after breathing in moldy cardboard dust for like 6 hours straight. We leaned back against a stack of wooden pallets near the industrial trash compactor while my cousin checked his phone. His dad was driving down with a flatbed trailer to help us haul the metal, but he was stuck behind a wreck on the interstate, so we were going to be killing time on the dock for a little bit. That's when this guy walked up from the gravel lot. There wasn't a single red flag about him initially. He looked like every other guy working an evening trade job. Clean cut, heavy canvas work shirt, thick leather tool belt, and wireless earbuds firmly in his ears. He looked totally normal, to be honest, except for maybe the fact that his work boots were completely pristine, without a single scuff or a speck of dust on them, which was barely noticeable at first glance, but he stopped a few feet away and nodded at my cousin. "Hey man, those are really solid steel-toed boots. What brand are they?" My cousin smiled, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and told him. Then the guy shifted his eyes to me, checking out my heavy canvas work trousers. "Yours look pretty tough too. Perfect for tearing down old drywall, huh?" I gave him a standard polite response. "Yeah, I think canvas is the only way to avoid getting cut up by rusty nails out here. Nice leather rig you've got on too." The guy cracked a very thin, hollow smile and said, "Yeah, I'm sure you really think that." The delivery of that was weirdly sarcastic, but I just figured that he had a dry, cynical sense of humor about manual labor or something. We kept up the casual, tired small talk for another minute or so. He asked us what specific unit number we were clearing out, and we told him that we were working on the abandoned lockers near the freight elevator. And the second that we mentioned the elevator, his face sort of tightened up. He started rambling about the security layout of the facility, but his tone got incredibly bitter and sort of intense. He muttered something about how locks are completely pointless when people are careless, and how none of the property in these lockers actually belongs to the people who leave it behind. We just sort of nodded along politely, trying to be decent to a guy who clearly was having a bit of a rough night. Then, the entire vibe completely shifted. Now, I cannot give you a logical, scientific explanation for what happened next, but the atmosphere on that concrete dock just changed in a split second. A wave of intense heat rushed up my neck, and the hair on my arms stood completely on end. It wasn't standard social anxiety. It was a primitive alarm going off in the center of my chest. The guy's face didn't twist into a scowl or anything, and his voice didn't rise. He kept talking at the exact same volume, but the expression in his eyes went completely dead. He was looking at the two of us the way that a predator looks at a target. There was this sudden, terrifying undercurrent of absolute malice and rage behind his eyes that had been completely hidden a second ago. While he was talking, his eyes shifted away from us for a split second, and he reached into his leather pouch, pulling out a heavy, blunt iron framing hammer. He didn't wave it around or swing it or anything. He just casually started tapping the solid steel head of the hammer directly against his own palm, seemingly bruising his skin over and over again, without looking down. He was just dead-eyeing us the whole time, his lower body completely frozen. My eyes darted to his tool belt at this point. He didn't have any actual construction supplies. No nails, no tape measure, no pencil. He just had that single heavy hammer, which was incredibly bizarre for somebody who claimed he was on site to fix a broken roll-up door. Then, right in the middle of a sentence about locker dimensions, he casually dropped, "I don't actually have a work order for this building tonight." Hearing me say that probably does not sound like a threat at all, but standing on that isolated concrete dock with him, my instincts were screaming that this person was completely unstable and highly dangerous. My cousin is one of those incredibly nice, oblivious guys who gets totally sucked into conversations and misses social cues all the time, and I knew that I had to break the connection immediately before the guy decided to act on whatever was brewing in his head. I didn't want to make a scene or show him that I was terrified, because I felt like any sudden movement would trigger a physical reaction, but I sort of slowly backed away, keeping my voice totally flat. Hey, my stomach is turning from that cheap vending machine coffee. I need to run back inside the front office break room real quick, okay? The guy's head snapped toward me, his eyes boring into my face practically. Oh, the office, huh? I didn't answer. I just walked through the heavy metal fire door, grabbed my cousin's sleeve, and pulled him hard toward the freight elevator. The second that the heavy iron gate slammed shut, I hit the button for the main lobby and pulled out my phone. My voice was cracking from the adrenaline. Hey, we need to call the supervisor right now. Get to the front gate. Do not go back down to the loading bay, okay? Through the echoing shaft of the elevator, I could now hear the guy's heavy boots walking up to the door on the floor above, his voice loud and entirely unbothered. Where did your friend go? Tell him to come back down here. We were having a good chat about the lockers. My cousin finally realized that something was really wrong with this guy, his face going pale as he kept his cool. Actually, we gotta wrap up the inventory. Have a good night, man. The guy let out a low, mocking laugh that echoed down the concrete hallway, clear as day. Yeah, I'm sure you really mean that. A minute later, we burst through the main lobby doors into the well-lit front parking lot. The sheer relief that hit my lungs made me dizzy. And before I could even start explaining why I panicked, my cousin grabbed my arm and looked back through the reinforced glass doors and said, No, you don't have to say anything. That guy was completely unhinged. I felt it too. We hid inside the locked security office until his dad's truck finally pulled up to the outer gate. The second that we ran out, threw our gear into the flatbed and climbed into the cab, his dad turned around, asking why we looked like we'd seen a ghost. I tried to explain what had just happened on the loading dock, my words sort of jumbling together a bit, my hand still shaking from the shock of it. But as the story came out of my mouth, it sounded totally pathetic. I mean, the guy hadn't swung the hammer at us. He had not explicitly threatened us or anything. He hadn't even insulted us. I mean, on paper, it was just a slightly awkward, sort of creepy conversation with a stranger in a storage facility, I guess. And yet, I have never in my entire life felt that level of pure, instinctual terror before. We drove out of the commercial facility loop, and as the truck accelerated onto the main avenue, we passed the perimeter fence of the back alley. The man was sitting entirely alone on a concrete barrier near the dark gravel lot, his hammer lying on the gravel beside him, staring straight down at the asphalt. He didn't look up as our truck roared past, but watching his shape shrink in the side mirror, I knew then with every fiber of my being that we had just walked away from something terrible. You wouldn't get how messy the trade setup is in these sprawling industrial parks unless you've actually worked in one. Because if you're only used to neat commercial storefronts, this whole chaotic layout sounds totally made up. I get that. But it is really how it is. So I'm 20 and working as an apprentice locksmith at a heavy-duty security shop. It's in an industrial corner, and since we're the only place for miles that does cheap walk-in key cutting, or lock rebuilding as well, and safe overrides, the daily backlog is an absolute joke. On any given Thursday, the concrete counter area is completely jammed with tradies and truckies spilling right out onto the pavement. It's loud, fast, and keeping the workshop swinging doors completely secured is basically a lost cause when you're trying to churn through 50 commercial lock sets a shift at least. Anyway, our main back work bay is split into two areas. You have the greasy machinery floor where the heavy key cutters, hydraulic presses, and pinning blocks sit. Then, right next to it, is a small glass partition office where the master computer console is set up and where we program the electronic transponder chips. Now, this went down about 3 months back during a brutal morning rush. So a young woman, probably around 19 or 20, had come in with a busted ignition barrel from her moped. I was standing over the main pinning block, carefully tweaking the tiny brass tumblers with tweezers and setting the springs to get a clean alignment. Because the workshop was so backed up and the garage door was constantly rolling up and down, an older guy, easily in his mid-50s, had wandered past the safety line and into the main tool bay, and was leaning up against a stack of storage crates. He wasn't a random intruder. He was the very next job on my clipboard, in fact, waiting for a simple duplicate warehouse key, and he just followed the previous customer inside because nobody was managing the front till to stop him. Once I had the girl's ignition barrel perfectly aligned, I stepped around the partition and into the programming booth to log it into the software. As I looked through the scratched glass viewing window to check the room before running the code machine, I noticed the older guy. He was holding his smartphone flat against his high-vis vest, tilting the top camera lens up at an incredibly strange angle, pointing it directly at the young woman's lower back while her back was turned to him. While he was aiming the screen, his other hand drifted down into his unzipped pocket, and he casually slipped out a small, heavy silver utility blade. He didn't wave it around or point it at her or anything. He just started scraping the edge of the metal blade directly against his thumb, peeling off thin slivers of his own calloused skin while dead-eyeing her back. He was completely motionless from the waist down, just scraping the blade and holding the phone still. My stomach instantly turned. It was a blatant, dirty attempt at taking non-consensual photos of a customer while she was distracted, paired with something way darker as well. I didn't even log into the computer. I turned around, grabbed the senior locksmith on duty, and we both marched right back into the main work bay. We confronted the guy on the spot, demanding to see his camera roll. He went bright red, quickly fumbling everything as he was trying to shove the utility knife and the phone back into his pockets. But we stepped right up to this guy's face and made him unlock the device right there. Sure enough, his recent folder was filled with 3 different stealth photos of the girl from behind. To make it even worse, one of the shots had been snapped while I was leaning over the workbench, meaning that I was captured in the background of this disgusting gallery. The senior smith grabbed the phone right out of his hand, deleted every single image, and then went straight into a recently deleted trash folder and permanently wiped them from the device storage. Since he was technically a logged customer, and we had already taken his payment voucher for the warehouse key, we made him stand by the door, ran his single duplicate through the automatic cutter, and literally threw his keys at him just to get him out of our hair. But while we were printing his receipt, the guy's entire demeanor shifted from embarrassed to incredibly aggressive and arrogant. He leaned over the wooden counter, pulled out a laminated clip-on badge and snapped, "You people have no idea who you're messing with. I write for powerful people. Give me your names right now." The senior smith was already completely exhausted from the morning rush and wasn't about to be intimidated by some local creep trying to flex a minor trade press pass. She didn't even look up from her monitor, in fact. She just said, "Nobody here has your name. Your keys are done. Get out of my shop before I have the guys from the tire bay throw you into the gravel." He sputtered for a second, realized that we weren't backing down, and literally slunk out of the sliding glass doors. Now, I know people here are going to ask why we didn't call the police or lock the gates or something, but you have to understand the reality of an understaffed industrial shop. We had 3 couriers waiting with pallets in the alley, an emergency commercial lockout call-out coming through the radio, and 0 budget for security guards. We caught him, we physically destroyed the files, and we protected the girl's privacy instantly. Standing around waiting 2 hours for a van to show up over a misdemeanor phone offense just really isn't viable when the backlog is building out into the street, literally. But I will say this. The whole thing left me feeling incredibly dirty for the rest of the week. People came to the trade house just trying to get their everyday gear sorted. And to use that environment to secretly photograph someone who is trying to get a lock fixed is a level of depravity that I really hope that I never have to witness again. Some people look back at their worst moments and they wonder about the grand, sweeping choices that saved them. But I still look back at this night and wonder if a simple, stubborn aversion to a specific texture is the only reason that I'm still around to even share this. This went down back in 2019. I was 20 at the time, working a tedious stocking shift at a commercial print shop in a pretty gritty industrial pocket of Iowa. A guy that I'd never seen before walked in the front loading bay, looked around for a second, and then marched straight up to my workbench to ask for my number. He was wearing clean work pants, a structured jacket, and had this very polite, confident, old-school charm that really completely caught me off guard, if I'm being honest. Against my better judgment, I said yes when he suggested picking me up the following Tuesday afternoon for a quick lunch date. When he pulled up to my apartment complex a few days later, he was driving a heavy, enclosed white cargo van. The second that I climbed into the passenger seat, he handed me a large, thick plastic container of pre-made mango smoothie. He smiled and said that he'd snagged it from a wholesale market right down the road from my place so that we could hit the highway faster. I took a tiny sip through the thick straw, and my mouth immediately recoiled. It was completely warm, heavy, and tasted chalky and bitter. I have an absolute fixation on cold, smooth textures and cannot stand warm or grainy drinks. That trivial little detail is the exact moment, too, that the entire trajectory of the night completely shifted. Because I couldn't stomach the texture, I set the plastic container down in the deep side pocket of the door panel. I didn't want to be a rude guest on the first date, so every few minutes I'd pick the bottle up, fake a long sip with my lips tight against the straw, and just pretended to swallow before sliding it back into the door pocket. But sitting there in the echoing, unlined cabin of the van, my brain started working overtime. Why would somebody buy a person a random heavy wholesale drink when the entire stated purpose of the afternoon was to go and sit down at a diner together? He hadn't even asked what flavors I liked. And then the red flags started piling up at lightning speed. He blew right past the central industrial exit where all the local food spots were. When I pointed it out, he gave a dismissive little laugh and said that he knew a much better secluded park a little further out of town. As we kept driving, I started catching him in weird, pointless lies. For instance, he claimed that he worked as a dispatcher at the main freight depot right down the street from my house, but I told him that that was impossible because my brother-in-law managed that specific depot yard and I knew the entire small crew pretty much by name. He didn't even try to defend the lie. He just went totally silent and dead-eyed the road ahead. Over the next 20 minutes, he asked if I had finished my smoothie, not just once or twice. He asked me at least 10 separate times, his eyes darting down to the door panel every single time that I took a fake sip. By the time that he had veered off the main state route, the sun had completely dipped behind the tree line, leaving the dirt road in total darkness. He then took a sharp turn down an unlit gravel road, heading directly into the dense woods out past the local water authority reservoir. At that point, a heavy, cold weight settled into my stomach. My survival instincts kicked in, and a voice in my head told me that I needed to remain completely calm, keep my voice level, and do absolutely nothing to provoke or escalate his behavior. Every time the van hit a rut in the dirt, something loose and metallic inside of the dashboard compartment would rattle furiously as well. It sounded like an industrial roll of thick copper wiring or maybe heavy metal chains shifting around or something. He kept tapping his fingers on the plastic housing though, completely fixated on the vibration while a strange intense smirk grew across his face. While he was driving, he reached down to the center console eventually and picked up a heavy matte black rifle laser sight, the kind meant to clip directly onto a tactical rail. He didn't say a word, but His thumb clicked the pressure switch on the side, and instantly an incredibly bright, intense red dot flared to life, projecting directly onto my chest, right over my heart. He held the detached sight perfectly steady in his grip, keeping the dot burning into my shirt while his eyes remained locked onto the dark road ahead. Every time, too, that his thumb pulsed down on the pressure pad, the red beam would flicker, painting a target on me in the pitch-black cabin. And then, his entire personality just dissolved. He began driving like an absolute maniac, violently jerking the steering wheel from side to side using only his elbows while gripping his own hair. He started screaming at the windshield, yelling at the top of his lungs that he was an unappreciated genius, that he was the next major prophet, and that I was his chosen queen. He slammed on the gas, tore off the graded road, and drove the van straight through a clearing and into the forest. Branches were scraping aggressively against the passenger side door, and eventually the tires crunched to a halt, the headlights cutting through the dark, reflecting off of a flat black sheet of water. He had stopped the vehicle right at the absolute lip of a remote reservoir lake, the front bumper hanging over the mud. He cut the engine and then he just sat there. For 15 agonizing minutes, neither of us said a word. He just stared through the windshield into the black water. The air inside the cabin felt thick, hot, and suffocating. It felt exactly like he was waiting for something to happen, or waiting for me to lose consciousness from whatever was mixed into that warm, chalky bottle. Suddenly, he opened his door and stepped out into the pitch black, slamming the heavy metal door behind him. I couldn't see where he went or what he was doing in the dark, and my pulse was now racing so quickly that I could feel it buzzing in my fingertips. The second the door latched, I grabbed my phone, slammed the screen brightness to 0, and frantically texted my friend, "Call me in exactly 60 seconds, tell me there's an emergency leak at the workshop and I need to come in right now to secure the bay. Don't ask questions, I'm out past the lower reservoir road." My phone started vibrating in my palm less than a minute later. I answered on the first ring, pretending to listen to a frantic update from a supervisor. The guy opened the driver's door right as I hung up, climbing back into the high seat. He smelled of cold mud and rust, and he stared at the glowing phone screen in my hand, his face completely blank. "So, you have to go back, huh?" he asked, his voice dead and hollow. Yeah," I said, keeping my breathing as steady as humanly possible. "My boss said the high-pressure line burst in the rear bay, and the whole floor is flooding. I'm the only key holder with the main valve code." He sat in the dark for another 3 minutes, staring at the lake, before he finally twisted the key into the ignition. He turned the van around and drove the entire 40 minutes back to my apartment complex in absolute unbroken silence. He didn't even look at me when I got out, and he tore out of that parking lot before my front door even clicked shut. I blocked his number immediately, and I never saw his vehicle in town again after that. To this day, I can't look at a pre-made plastic store drink without getting a sick feeling in my throat. If that drink hadn't have been warm and gritty, if I had actually swallowed whatever was inside that bottle instead of just pretending to sip it to be polite, I really don't think that I ever would have made it out of those woods. My partner and I currently live above and manage a historic coaching inn nestled in a rural pocket of Gloucestershire, UK. The core masonry dates back to the mid-1700s, and for the first century of its existence, the building functioned as a commercial livery yard and transit stables before being converted into a public house. Because of the ongoing aggressive physical disruptions we experienced during our first year of management, we quietly paid a private spiritual sensitive to inspect the property in 2014. The woman was thoroughly professional, thankfully, but her reaction to the upper layout was deeply unsettling. The first floor function room is a massive 15-foot high hall dominated by exposed original oak stable beams. Beams that local parish records indicate were used for makeshift judicial executions during the agricultural riots of the 1830s. The sensitive claimed the room acted as a dense, unmapped transit corridor for multiple historic currents, including the residual consciousness of a young girl, roughly 11 years old, who had perished in the rafters, apparently. However, her reaction to the lower cellar, where we store our commercial beer barrels, was far worse. The moment that her foot hit the bottom stone step, her breathing became entirely shallow. She refused to stay inside of the room for more than 60 seconds, claiming that the space harbored a severely hostile, non-human compression of energy that was causing her chest pains. She demanded that we immediately vacate the lower level, in fact. At the time, I sort of just shrugged it off as a psychological suggestibility. But over the last decade, the building's structural anomalies have become entirely, well, normal. So my partner and several regular patrons have frequently reported watching the distinct silhouettes of an elderly couple sitting at the far end of the oak bar during off-peak hours, only for the space to be entirely empty when staff approached to take an order. I never saw the couple myself, but 3 summers ago, I was tending to the hanging baskets in the rear courtyard when I looked up at the darkened window of the locked upper function room. A man's face was pressed flat against the glass, staring down at me with an entirely rigid, expressionless posture. My partner, a kitchen porter, and 2 suppliers all witnessed it simultaneously too. Assuming that the trespasser had slipped past the staff doors, my partner and the porter sprinted up the wooden staircase. By the time that they threw the doors open, the hall was entirely vacant, but the heavy velvet curtain covering that specific window was still swinging violently when they got there. When we pulled the closed-circuit security logs, the digital cameras showed 0 human presence in that corridor, only the sudden isolated displacement of the curtain as if a heavy weight had brushed past it. There were no open vents or drafts or anything that could account for it. Now, the physical interference in the lower cellar, though, that has had a direct commercial impact. You see, over the past 5 years, every single drayman and cellar hand that we've employed has reported a localized static sensation whenever they change a keg, specifically the feeling of invisible fingers tightening around their hair or tearing at the fabric of their work shirts. Worse too, for a continuous 3-year period, the building's main industrial fire and burglar alarms would trigger simultaneously at exactly 3:03 a.m. almost every night. Every single diagnostic log indicated that the trip originated from the cellar sensors. Whenever my partner went downstairs in the dark to investigate a potential break-in, he would find the heavy pressurized brass coupler lines manually disconnected from the metal keg heads. And anyone who works in the trade knows that engaging a commercial keg coupler requires an immense amount of deliberate, downward physical force and a twisting lock mechanism too. Yet, these line hoses were being systematically uncoupled and thrown into the damp flagstones, causing us to lose hundreds of gallons of premium stock. We had the manufacturer out 4 separate times as well to recalibrate the alarm hardware, and each time the technicians verified that the batteries, the wiring, and the optical sensors were entirely flawless. Simultaneously, too, the activity began breaching the perimeter of our private residential flat upstairs, which sits directly adjacent to the historic function room. Every evening at 3:03 a.m., on the dot, we would hear the rapid, light tapping of small bare feet running the entire length of our internal hallway, occasionally accompanied by a flat whispering hiss, which was terrifying. We share our quarters with 2 terriers and 2 cats, and whenever the hallway sound started, the cats' hackles would rise instantly, their fur standing completely on end as they stared blindly into the dark corridor. The dogs would crouch low against the bedroom door, emitting a deep and sub-audible sort of growl that vibrated through the floorboards. During the absolute peak of this activity, though, in 2022, I began experiencing a severe and unexplained physiological reaction, is the only way that I could put it. Every morning I would wake up covered in deep purple clustered bruises across my torso and inner arms, accompanied by a wave of intense and debilitating nausea. The bruising was so severe as well that my GP admitted me to the regional infirmary for extensive hematology panels, checking me for various aggressive blood conditions and cancers. Over 6 months, I underwent hundreds of blood draws and 5 separate internal scans, you name it. The specialists, though, were just completely baffled. My clotting factors were pristine, my vascular system was entirely healthy, and the hospital officially logged my case as a medical anomaly. The activity experienced a massive decline last year, though, giving us a brief window of just total peace, which was absolutely serene. However, I am currently 20 weeks pregnant, and 3 nights ago, the atmospheric weight returned to the flat. My partner, he was cashing up the tills downstairs when I heard 2 distinct heavy female coughs originate from the empty armchair in our private living room. The dogs instantly whipped their heads towards the empty chair, their ears pinned back. And since that night, there's this constant feeling that I'm being watched. My own mother completely refuses to spend the night in our guest room as well because she develops an instant, blinding migraine the moment that she sits down, claiming that the air feels occupied. Last summer, a temporary relief manager stayed in that same spare room for 2 weeks. She woke up on her 3rd morning with 3 deep parallel vertical scratch marks tracking down her left shoulder blade. The bedroom door, it's been deadbolted from the inside, and our animals were locked in our master bedroom all night. I'm terrified that this hostile energy is re-anchoring itself to the layout precisely because of my pregnancy. I just cannot afford to endure sleepless nights or the return of the unexplained physical bruising while carrying my child. I'm entirely convinced that whatever is manipulating the cellar lines and mimicking voices in our hallway is targeting the structural living space, and I need to know the specific, non-religious protocols for how to get rid of whatever this is. This happened back in 2018 when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was living full-time with my grandfather in his ground-floor condominium unit in a quiet forested suburb of Alberta. The suite, it sat at the very back of the complex, facing a dense unlit belt of pine trees. On this particular weekend, my 14-year-old sister and my 4-year-old brother, they were staying over so that I could look after them while my mother was away. My partner, who was 24 as well, was also hanging out with us too. It must have been around 8:30, and the evening was entirely normal. We were all gathered in the main living area, which featured a large sliding glass door opening directly onto a concrete patio, and a secondary deep-set picture window looking straight into the tree line. Because it was pitch black outside, we had drawn the heavy fabric vertical blinds across the sliding door, but the smaller picture window by the television, it was still uncovered. We had dragged a double mattress into the center of the room so that the kids could watch a movie at night. My little brother was sitting on the edge of the mattress in just his diaper, right in the middle of changing into his pajamas, and I was standing about 3 feet away, directly aligned with the open glass of the picture window. My partner had literally just stepped out the front door to drive down the block and pick up some takeaway food. The locks on the front door had clicked shut, maybe 30 seconds prior, and then the room just completely transformed. It didn't feel like a spiritual presence or anything, but it felt like a violent mechanical drop in localized pressure. The air was instantly sucked out of the room, causing all of our ears to pop painfully and the ambient sound of the television to go entirely muffled, like we were suddenly underwater. The sensation was so physical too that my 14-year-old sister instantly whipped her head around to look at me, her eyes wide with confusion. In the exact millisecond our eyes locked, my 4-year-old brother stood up perfectly straight on the mattress. The color drained from his face so fast that he turned a sickly translucent grey. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the glass behind my shoulder and began screaming at the absolute top of his lungs. A piercing, frantic shriek of just pure primal survival panic. "Close the lines," is what he said. "It's on glass." My stomach dropped so violently that I felt instantly physically sick. My sister sprinted across the room, grabbing my arm, while my brother continued to scream, hyperventilating so hard that his chest was heaving. Neither my sister nor I could see anything through the black pane, but the sheer terror radiating from a 4-year-old made me lunge forward and violently rip the cord to drop the blinds over the window. The moment, too, that the plastic slats snapped shut, it was like everything began to move in slow motion. My peripheral vision blurred, and a thick dreamlike sort of detachment settled over my brain. It felt like trying to sprint through deep water. We were holding my brother, trying to muffle his crying, when his eyes darted toward the seam of the closed vertical blinds. He began kicking his legs, screaming even louder, saying it didn't stop. Panicking, I scooped him up under my arm and ran toward the sliding glass patio door, my sister clinging to the back of my shirt. I completely lost my head, if I'm being honest. I didn't want to be trapped in that compressed living room, so I yanked the sliding door open, tore through the outdoor vertical blinds, and burst out into the concrete patio into the freezing night air. The moment, too, that we hit the outdoor air, the pressure returned to normal. My brother's hyperventilation slowed down for a brief second. His breathing became less labored as he buried his face into my neck. But the slow-motion, detached sensation hadn't left my head yet. I was standing on the dark patio, looking at the silent pine trees when my brother stiffened again. He slowly turned his head toward the empty brick wall of the condo, just 2 feet to our left. His voice dropped into a terrifying flat whimper. "Next to us," is what he said. I nearly passed out from the sheer spike of adrenaline, and I didn't even look at the wall. I turned around, carried him up the concrete garden stairs, and ran entirely out to the bright-lit asphalt parking lot at the front of the complex. We collapsed onto the communal concrete steps, all 3 of us shaking uncontrollably in the cold. Once I could finally control my fingers again, I pulled out my phone to check my partner's location on the tracking app, assuming that they must have been halfway across the neighborhood by now, given how much time I thought had elapsed. When the screen lit up, my brain just experienced what I can only describe as a massive logical glitch. She had only left the house 4 minutes ago. Her car icon was idling at the traffic light just 3 blocks down the street. The entire ordeal, running through the flat, the patio escalation, the slow-motion escape, had occurred in a span of less than 3-4 minutes. I called them, though, frantically, my voice cracking as I explained that we were locked out on the front steps and they needed to come back immediately. They were completely confused, repeating that they had just turned the corner and didn't understand how a crisis of that scale could have unfolded in the time that it took them to listen to one song on the radio. We sat on those cold concrete stairs for over half an hour, I think, until they eventually returned with some food, refusing to even look at the front windows of the flat. Now, what makes the memory even more unsettling is our cat. He was an incredibly vocal, territorial indoor cat who usually followed us into every room. During the entire panic inside, he was completely missing. But the moment that we sat down on the front exterior steps, I looked up at the high, narrow transom window above the building's front door, and the cat was sitting perfectly upright on the interior ledge, staring down at us through the glass with a completely unblinking focus. He didn't meow or scratch at the pane. He just watched us with a really eerie stillness. My little brother was completely disassociated for the rest of the night. He wouldn't look at the television or eat any food, completely shutting down. Because he was so young, it was incredibly difficult to get a coherent description of what he had actually seen through the glass, but he kept repeating two distinct details to my older sister while she held him. He seemed to be saying that it was an immense towering figure that didn't have a distinct face, and that it was like glowing white-yellow, something like a light bulb, I think. As he grew older, his mind completely blocked out the event. Whenever my sister and I brought it up years later, he genuinely had no recollection of it whatsoever. But I know for an absolute fact that he wasn't playing a game. I mean, you just cannot simulate that level of acute shock. I mean, he literally lost his skin color, the near fainting from hyperventilation, and the total dilation of his pupils. I mean, again, you just cannot fake that. My grandfather's condominium always had a strange feeling to it. But that specific night was a complete physical breach of the property's perimeter. My sister and I, we never saw anything, but the physical displacement of the air in that room, it told us everything that we needed to know. Whatever my little brother was looking at through the glass, it wasn't standing on the lawn. It seemed to be right there, and somehow it was manipulating the entire environment. I'm a 28-year-old dental hygienist, and my husband and I currently live in a 4-bedroom suburban house in Berkshire where I was raised. Growing up here, the property felt structurally quiet to me, I guess. I mean, I occasionally heard the settling timber or footsteps on the landing at night, but nothing that really disrupted my routine or gave me second thought. My mother and sister, however, had an entirely different relationship with that layout. Throughout our teenage years, my sister was systematically targeted by, well, an anomaly. Objects would frequently displace themselves from her chest of drawers, and she routinely pointed out geometric distortions in developed family photographs. The most acute incident, though, occurred when she and I were sitting on her mattress discussing a school project, when, without warning, every heavy textbook and storage box on her built-in closet shelves were violently propelled forward into the center of the room. My sister jokingly designated the presence as Alfred, a piece of dark humor that turned incredibly sour when a maternal aunt uncovered parish records indicating our great-great-grandfather, of the same name, had passed away from an aggressive fever in that exact sector of the house. My mother had experiences too. She was plagued by acoustic mimics, I think is what you call them. Specifically, the clear, distinct sound of my sister or me calling out her name from empty rooms. The phenomenon was so precise, too, that even my own father, who was an extreme religious skeptic, even he believed it. While he and my mother were preparing dinner in the kitchen one night, both of them froze as my voice clearly echoed down the stairwell, calling out for my mum. But they both knew that night, I was at least 40 miles away, spending the weekend at a friend's house and reading. When my mother and sister eventually moved out into their own respective properties, they claimed the acoustic mimics followed them too, embedding themselves into the drywall of their new homes. I assumed that they were simply hypersensitive, because when my husband and I took over the mortgage of the childhood home 3 years ago, the place was entirely quiet. The silence, though, lasted exactly until last October, when we brought our newborn daughter home from the hospital. Now, medical professionals might immediately attribute the following timeline to chronic sleep deprivation, postpartum exhaustion, or perhaps even hormonal shifts, but I'm a medical professional myself, and I clung to those rationalizations for months as well. But human exhaustion does not manipulate mechanical door hardware. The disruption began with the return of the acoustic mimic, this time targeting my husband. During our daughter's second month, she began sleeping in a predictable and stable routine, waking only once in the early hours, really. Because my husband worked long shifts as a structural engineer, I took over the night shift responsibilities entirely so that he could remain rested. Yet, despite him being deep asleep in the master bedroom, he began waking up to the unmistakable sound of my voice whispering his name directly from the dark ensuite doorway. And then, the anomalies began focusing strictly on my proximity to the baby. The first physical escalation occurred at 2 a.m. during a night when our daughter was entirely inconsolable, screaming from acute colic. I was pacing the length of the nursery, bouncing her against my shoulder, when the ambient temperature in the center of the room just instantaneously dropped. A profound, freezing chill tracked directly up my spine, so intense that it actually made my breath hitch. In that exact second, too, my daughter stopped crying mid-shriek. Her entire body went completely rigid, and her eyes snapped open, focusing with absolute unblinking clarity on a point in the air precisely 3 inches behind my left shoulder. The sudden stillness of an infant who had been hyperventilating for an hour was so unnatural that I immediately sat down in the nursing chair, pinning my back against the wall, paralyzed by a wave of intense and visceral paranoia until, well, dawn, really. 3 weeks later, something else happened in broad daylight. It was a bright, clear morning, around 7, I think. I had brought our daughter into the living room for her morning feed and a brief period of floor play before her first nap. The living room's gliding chair was positioned with its high back directly facing the heavy timber door of our master bedroom, which was completely closed and latched. And as I rocked her, she began to fuss a bit. Simultaneously, that same distinct, localized wave of freezing air swept over my neck all of a sudden. My daughter instantly ceased her fussing, her eyes locking onto the space directly behind the glider. And then, behind me, the distinct metallic sound of the brass door handle turning echoed through the silent room. I heard the mechanical click for the internal latch withdrawing from the strike plate. The heavy timber door slowly, smoothly swung wide open. Hoping against hope that my husband had simply heard the baby crying and was stepping out to assist us, I called out his name into the corridor. There was no response. I turned the chair around. The hallway was completely empty. I sprinted into the bedroom. My husband was fast asleep under the duvet, snoring loudly. The shock of the mechanical manipulation, though, was so severe that we spent the afternoon completely rearranging the living room furniture so the gliding chair sat squarely in a corner, eliminating any blind spots behind my head. I have watched that specific door latch slide open twice since that morning, too. To preserve my own sanity, I've stopped pulling the door fully shut to ensure that the internal latch never fully catches. That way, whenever it does swing open, I can usually convince myself that the draft from the pedestal fan finally generated enough atmospheric pressure to push the timber. The footsteps, though, and the low disjointed whispers, they continue on the landing between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, but I have systematically sort of altered my movement patterns within the house to hopefully avoid them entirely. I am acutely aware that whatever anchored itself to my mother and sister during their youth did not vacate this property when they left. It simply went dormant, waiting for the introduction of a new and vulnerable child, it seems, to reactivate entirely. I'm 21 and a uni student, living in an old multi-story house in the suburbs of Nottingham. Looking back, my childhood here was full of weird habits that my mum always blamed on night terrors. She used to tell me that she'd find me standing completely stiff in the dark at 3 in the morning, my face just inches from the wall, having full, quiet conversations with the bare plaster. But as I got older, the things happening in the house became impossible to explain. The worst spot has always been the basement. Ever since I was a little kid, I've had a gut-level hatred of going down there. The air always felt incredibly heavy and metallic, enough to make me instantly sick to my stomach every time. Heavy tools and wood scraps left flat on the workbenches will constantly move on their own and thud onto the concrete floor when everything else is completely still. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd always catch these fast, dark shapes darting across the doorway of the boiler room. But whenever I whipped my head around to look, the space was always completely empty. The physical stuff started ramping up, though, when I was a teenager. I was sitting on the living room sofa with a friend one day when I felt a sharp, hard yank on my hair, like somebody had grabbed a few strands and explicitly pulled them upward. I spun around instantly, but the sofa was pushed flat against a solid brick wall. The weird thing, though, was that there wasn't even an inch of space for someone to be hiding there. At the same time, we kept seeing this incredibly tall, dark shadow around the house. For years, I tried to convince myself, too, that it was just a weird optical illusion from the streetlights outside, but the shape was always exactly the same. The first time that I saw it clearly, I was about 17. I was lying awake at night and looked out of my open bedroom door toward the landing, and standing right against the guest room frame was a massive pitch-black silhouette. It was so impossibly tall and gaunt that its upper body had to bend at a sharp and unnatural angle just to fit under the ceiling. When I told my dad about the weird shape the next morning, his usual practical, no-nonsense attitude completely dropped. He's a total skeptic who doesn't believe in anything paranormal, but even he went totally pale and admitted that he'd seen the exact same giant silhouette in that exact same corridor 3 months earlier. Things started getting a lot more aggressive after that, too. One winter night, I walked into my dark bedroom and saw a low, dark shape with what looked like multiple limbs scramble across the carpet. Thinking it was one of our German shepherds, I watched it head straight under the carpet, but the gap between the base of the bed and the floor is less than 6 inches. And I mean, there's just no physical way that a big dog could fit under there. When I called out, both of our dogs came trotting up the stairs from the kitchen downstairs, completely clueless. The scariest thing, though, well, that happened 2 winters ago when my sister and I were home alone, and is why I'm here. She came into the kitchen shaking, and she said that she could hear heavy footsteps on the floorboards right by the bottom of the stairs. I went out into the hallway with her to listen, and the sound was unmistakable. Heavy, solid boots were stomping up the wooden stairs one by one, making the drywall vibrate. We thought that we were dealing with a violent home invasion at first, so I grabbed a chef's knife from the counter and we ran into the small family bathroom and locked ourselves inside. Through the thick wooden door, we listened to those heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth along the narrow hallway carpet. We were absolutely paralyzed with fear. We heard the front security door downstairs slam shut so hard that it rattled the pipes. Assuming that the intruder had left, we stayed locked into the bathroom and phoned our grandmother, who lived just 2 streets away, asking her to bring her spare keys and check the outside of the house. We saw her car pull into the gravel driveway, and she knocked on the window. My sister and I finally came out to unlock the door. Every single door and window, the front door, the back porch, all the downstairs window latches, were all locked and bolted from the inside. Nobody else had a key except my parents, and they were miles away in London. Whatever had marched up those stairs and slammed the door had never actually broken a physical lock to get in or out. The house, it really took a turn for the worse about 3 months ago, though. Out of pure curiosity, I downloaded a ghost hunting audio app on my phone to check for electronic voice phenomena, and ran a few cycles down in the basement at one point. The audio files actually picked up clear, muffled voices that seemed to answer my specific questions. Ever since I did that, the whole atmosphere of the house has turned just incredibly hostile. The air feels permanently heavy, and our dogs flat out refuse to step out onto the upstairs landing anymore. 2 nights ago, it finally breached our bedroom too, I think. A friend and I were sitting on the bed when Alexa, from Amazon, on the dresser, suddenly went dead silent. And right then, the heavy power cord was violently yanked sideways straight out of the wall socket and dropped to the floor. In that exact same second, too, the closed bedroom door was thrown inward with a massive bang, like somebody had smashed a heavy shoulder into it. The final straw, though, that happened yesterday afternoon while we were clearing out the old wooden coat closet in the front hallway. Scraped and deeply charred right into the hidden plaster wall behind the coat hooks was a horrific image. It looked like it had been systematically burned into the wall with a high-temperature torch or something. The burn mark showed a small, featureless child tightly clutching an electrical wire, following the line down toward the floorboards. Standing directly behind the child was a second, much larger shape, with long, stretched-out hands wrapped completely around the small figure's neck. The soot residue is completely fresh too, and the smell of the burnt plaster is still leaking out of the closet. We are now actively looking for a new place to live, and whatever has burned itself into the walls of this place isn't staying hidden anymore, and we just don't want to be here. I'm 29 and work the permanent night shift as an industrial plant operator out in Ohio. Because of my schedule, my whole routine is completely flipped. I usually wake up at around 5 p.m., run my errands in the evening, and find myself wide awake and restless in the early hours of the morning. To stay in shape, I started walking a big mile-long loop that connects two old Victorian-era cemeteries, sitting directly across a two-lane county road from each other. Because of my shifts, I usually do these walks between like 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning. Even though the place is totally isolated, it never really creeped me out. The grounds, they always felt completely quiet and just sort of empty. Anyway, last night was really no different. I got to the fence of the larger cemetery at around 2:30, and I parked my car right against the iron railings, directly opposite the gates of the smaller yard. I started my routine by crossing the road into the smaller cemetery, using a small flashlight to read the old headstones. After about 20 minutes, I would say, I crossed back over the tarmac to the main grounds to finish the big 1-mile loop. I had my noise-cancelling headphones on, listening to a lecture, and would occasionally step off the path to upright small statues or trinkets that had been knocked over by the wind. By 3:15, I was finishing up the last part of the loop, coming up toward the main gates right behind where my car was parked. I had parked directly under a bright street lamp, and as I got within about 30 yards of the car, the yellow light flooded through the rear windshield, showing a stark and perfectly clear silhouette of a large man sitting completely upright right in the middle of the back seat. I stopped dead in my tracks on the gravel path. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light. Maybe the street lamp hitting the headrests or the window tint or something. I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds. The shape had a distinct physical bulk to it too that completely blocked out the light from the other side of the road. Assuming now that I was walking right into a car break-in, my adrenaline spiked. Because I walk these dark roads alone all the time, I carry a firearm in a concealed waistband holster, and so keeping my eyes locked on the back window, I pulled my weapon and stepped silently off the gravel onto the wet grass, trying to loop around and flank the passenger side. As I shifted angles to get a direct look through the side window, the silhouette's head slowly and smoothly turned right toward me. The movement was really weirdly fluid, without any hesitation. There were no facial features, though, no clear texture, and no reflection from the street lamp. Just a dense, pitch-black mass taking up the physical space of the back seat. I dropped into a low crouch behind a thick granite headstone, using the stone for cover now. Reaching into my pocket, I pressed the unlock button on my key fob, knowing that it would instantly trigger the bright, white LED interior dome lights. I braced myself to confront an intruder hiding on the floorboards. The locks clicked open, the entire inside of the car was instantly flooded with bright white light. But the car was completely empty. Mind you, the change was instantaneous. There was no sound of a door opening, no shift in the car's weight, and no shadow running off into the darkness of the cemetery anywhere. Whatever had been sitting on the back seat just simply ceased to exist the exact millisecond that the lights came on. I quickly advanced on the car with my weapon raised, my boots sinking into the mud a bit. I did a full careful walk around of the exterior before looking straight down through the glass into the rear footwells. There was no space under those seats to hide a grown man. The floors were totally bare anyway. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and tore away from the cemetery gates at full speed without ever looking back at the rearview mirror once. Now, I like to think of myself as a pretty practical, detail-oriented sort of guy by trade, but the sheer precision of what happened has completely messed with me. I mean, your eyes can play tricks on you with shadows, for sure, but a shadow doesn't turn its head to literally track you through a graveyard like that. Back in the winter of 2008, when I was 16, my family moved into a pretty damp and drafty apartment. It was a bleak concrete high-rise with the radiators constantly hissing, and the winter sun was setting by 3 in the afternoon in this place. During those long, dark afternoons, I used to read tarot cards for my school friends on the kitchen table, never for money or anything, but just to pass the time a little bit. But whenever I shuffled the deck alone in the empty flat, the air would turn heavy and I'd get this distinct prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like somebody was standing right behind my chair, peering over my shoulder. One Tuesday, I came home exhausted and decided to catch a quick 30-minute nap before volleyball practice. I lay down on my right side at the very edge of the mattress, staring at the faded wallpaper, my mind sort of drifting into the heavy twilight zone right before deep sleep. When suddenly, a flat voice echoed directly inside the center of my skull, "Don't read tarot." Without thinking, fueled by teenage irritation, I snapped back in my mind for it to go away. The second that I opened my eyes, the breath was completely sucked out from my lungs. Squatting on the floorboards directly in my face, barely inches away, was what I can only describe as a wretched, hairless entity. Its skin was pale, translucent grey, covered in deep wrinkles. It had massive sunken eyes that were entirely bloodshot and dark, and its lips were pulled back to reveal sharp yellow teeth. Sprouting from the center of its bald scalp were roughly 20 long, brittle grey hairs that almost floated in the stagnant air. Before I could even scream, I forced my eyelids shut. The moment that the darkness hit, my entire body experienced a violent and sickening physical sensation, exactly like being dropped into an industrial washing machine on a high-speed rinse cycle. My equilibrium completely shattered all of a sudden, and when the spinning abruptly cut out, the bedroom was gone. I opened my eyes, but there was no light, only a dense, freezing subterranean darkness. The air smelled of like wet lime, and from somewhere high above I could hear the slow, rhythmic dripping sound of water hitting a heavy, flat stone surface, I think. Then, tearing through the cavernous space came the agonizing shriek of a woman. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, so loud that it vibrated right through my teeth. Desperate to escape, I fought against a massive invisible weight to force my eyes open in the real world. When my eyelids finally cracked as well, I was back on my mattress, panting and drenched in cold sweat. While looking for a flashlight desperately in the kitchen drawer later that evening, I pulled out the old wooden drawer entirely and noticed a small hidden structural gap in the cabinetry underneath. Reaching inside, my fingers pulled out an old grease-stained Russian military identification booklet from like the late 1960s. The photograph had been systematically and aggressively scraped out with a razor blade, but tucked into a plastic sleeve was a small hand-drawn charcoal sketch of the exact same bald and sort of wrinkled entity that I had just seen in my room. annotated with a single frantic line written in faded purple ink: "The Cellar Watchman." The sudden shock of a physical, non-paranormal confirmation of that specific face hidden in the woodwork made my stomach drop. I shoved the booklet back into the recess, trembling. The second instance occurred a few months later, and unfortunately, it left a far deeper psychological scar than even the first one. So, I had completely ruined my sleep schedule studying for exams and decided to pull a full 24-hour fast to reset my internal clock. By 1 p.m. the next day, the sleep deprivation caught up to me, and I collapsed onto my stomach on the couch. My cat curled up right against my hip, purring softly as I drifted off. Out of nowhere, though, a deep, radiating warmth enveloped my entire torso. It felt exactly like a massive, incredibly heavy pair of arms wrapped around me from behind in a comforting, protective embrace. But within about 3 seconds, logic pierced through the haze. I was entirely alone in a locked apartment. As the panic set in, a voice spoke directly beside my ear. It was weird and unnatural. It had a sort of overlapping cadence that was neither distinct male nor female, yet it sounded terrifyingly familiar. It spoke in a rapid, rhythmic language that I had never heard before in my life, and yet some part of my brain was sort of able to understand the context of what it was saying. Terrified, I began desperately reciting the lines of an old prayer under my breath, and the moment that those words left my thoughts, the familiar voice instantly dissolved into a distorted, piercing shriek. The sheer terror broke the paralysis, and I violently forced myself up into a sitting position on the cushions. My cat was sitting perfectly calm at the foot of the couch, staring blankly at the empty corner of the room. The second that I tried to stand up, my vision completely tunneled out, and I instantly blacked out cold onto the mattress. I woke up some hours later, and I didn't know what had happened. The final and most calculated breach occurred after we broke the lease, though, and moved to a remote ground-floor farm cottage. The cabin was bordered by miles and miles of dense protected timberland, and for the first 2 months, the mountain air actually felt entirely inert. But by late November, things came back, seemingly targeting the rear utility wall almost every night at exactly 11 o'clock. It sounded exactly like a handful of coarse gravel or heavy river dirt was being aggressively hurled from the tree line directly against the external housing of our large cast-iron HVAC compressor. On the night of June 17th, and I remember this, I sat up in the dark kitchen to listen for it myself. Right on the hour the impact came, 3 distinct heavy volleys of gravel rattling against the metal casing. My father and I immediately grabbed our industrial flashlights and sprinted outside, sweeping the beams across the perimeter. There were no animals, no low-hanging branches, and absolutely no fresh debris scattered on the concrete pad around the unit. We even had a technician pull the shroud apart a few days prior. The internal fans and the coils were entirely clear, and the casing was structurally sound too. The situation shifted violently 3 days later, though. Around 6 in the morning, while the entire household was still asleep, a massive explosive impact literally detonated against the utility wall. This time it didn't sound like loose gravel, too. It sounded more like a heavy, dense boulder had been launched directly at the metal compressing casing. The shock wave was so severe, too, that the cast-iron housing violently shuddered against the concrete, and the heavy condensation that had pooled onto the internal fins was physically sprayed across the window glass inside. We bolted out the back door in our undershirts, expecting to find a shattered window or a pile of loose rocks or something. But the yard was completely bare. There wasn't a single grain of dirt or a stray pebble on the concrete pad anywhere. But when I knelt down with a flashlight to inspect the metal shroud later that morning, I discovered 3 deep, jagged structural dents driven right into the thick iron plating, something that would require an immense amount of force or energy to do that. I really don't know how something like that even happens, and so, to this day, I still have no explanation for it. Back in 1993, my family rented a pretty isolated house out on some flatlands. Decades before the house was built, the land had been an old commercial sheep farm, and the property was still dotted with weathered timber shearing sheds, rusted wire pens, and old concrete drainage ditches. Growing up there, the whole house had this weird, heavy energy to it, and a lot of bizarre and unexplained things used to happen in our bedrooms with terrifying regularity. My older brother and sister had rooms right next to each other at the end of the hall, and almost every single night, their heavy pine bed frames would violently shudder and shake at the exact same second. And to make it worse, they both kept waking up to see a towering, faceless shadow figure standing dead still at the foot of their beds. I was in the small spare bedroom at the back of the house, right across the hall from the main bathroom. My parents told me that when I was a toddler, that room was a hotbed for weird audio things. In fact, apparently they used to stand out in the dark landing and listen to me, having full back-and-forth conversations with the inside of my built-in cedar wardrobe. The talking wasn't even the worst part, though. I would apparently routinely wake up, heavy breathing and crying, because it felt like an invisible force was firmly tickling the bare soles of my feet. It happened so often that my parents started a routine where they'd come and get me at 2 a.m. every single night so that I could sleep in a cot in their room. Things shifted, though, when my older brother left. My sister moved down into this bigger bedroom in the basement, and I took over her old room right opposite my parents'. The second that original spare bedroom was empty, it started running on its own loop. I would lie awake at night, listening to the locked wardrobe door click open, and the bare iron springs of the empty mattress creaking like something heavy was shifting around on it, and the desktop printer on the desk randomly turning on and cycling its roller in the dark. We had a heavy farm cat as well, but there's no way that a cat had the weight to compress those old iron mattress springs like that. Just no way. The escalation, though, happened during a brutal summer thunderstorm one day. A lightning strike blew out the local transformer, plunging the entire house into pitch-black darkness. While I was dead asleep, I ended up sleepwalking that night. My mum woke up to the sound of me screaming for her from across the hall, and when she ran out into the landing with a flashlight, she found me trapped in a bizarre and sort of mindless loop. I was marching straight into the closed doors of the empty spare room's wardrobe, back up 2 steps, and then throwing my entire weight against the wooden frame again and again. The exact second that my mum grabbed my shoulders to snap me out of it, the power suddenly kicked back on, flooding the hallway with bright light. And in that split second, I remember sort of waking up all of a sudden. I looked past her shoulder into the empty spare room, and a young boy, totally pale and wearing old-fashioned mid-century work clothes, was standing right in the doorway. He made a slow and deliberate come here sort of gesture with his hand before he just vanished after I blinked. The winter that my grandmother came to stay for the weekend and slept in that spare room, the next morning, she stormed into the kitchen completely furious and confronted my father. "Why did you come into my room and wake me up at dawn?" she demanded. My dad was totally bewildered and told her that he hadn't gone anywhere near her room. My grandmother thought that he was playing a sick joke and laid out exactly what had happened. She said that a man with my dad's exact build, height, and hair had stepped right out of the wardrobe. He walked to the bottom of the bed and forcefully grabbed her big toe to wake her up. When she asked what he wanted, the figure replied in a flat and sort of monotone voice, "You need to assist with the yard maintenance." It was the middle of January and the yard was buried under 3 feet of packed snow. The figure then just sort of turned around, walked back into the wardrobe, and the latch clicked shut. The final thing that happened, though, was when my mum and I both caught a brutal winter flu one day. To keep my dad from catching it before his shifts at the manufacturing plant that he worked at, my mother and I moved into the spare bedroom to isolate a little bit. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up to that exact same terrifying feeling from my childhood. Invisible fingers aggressively tickling my feet, followed by the distinct weight of a human body settling down into the mattress right next to me. At first, thinking that my mother was shifting over to comfort me, I rolled around to face her. The space beside me, though, was completely empty. Through the open bedroom door, I could see the bathroom light shining into the landing too, and my mother was standing at the sink across the hall, pouring a glass of water for herself. When I asked her why she had reached under the covers to touch my feet, she stopped, turned around, and looked at me with just pure terror. Whatever was living inside of that house wasn't just a random echo. It was actively mimicking our voices and shapes to seemingly get close to us while we were sleeping. So my husband and I, we manage a remote cabin out in the thick woods of the Appalachian foothills. The land out there is incredibly rugged, packed with dense pine trees and steep rocky edges. Because we're so isolated, we always invite large groups of our close friends out for weekend hangouts and whatnot. Now, the weird stuff started on a clear, completely still evening in July. My husband and I were just relaxing out on the back wooden deck when out of nowhere, this incredibly loud, high-pitched screech literally tore through the air, coming from a spot exactly 3 feet in front of our faces. It was absolutely deafening, and held a completely flat, steady tone for at least 15 seconds straight. It didn't sound like a bobcat, or a fox, or any animal that I'd ever heard before. Terrified by how loud it was, we literally bolted inside. Within 10 seconds, 4 of our friends came sprinting up the stairs from the basement, asking what kind of industrial machine had just exploded on the lawn. Exactly 10 minutes later, while we were all gathered in the kitchen, that exact same 15-second screech went off again from the same spot on the deck. And well, that was really it. We locked all the security doors and stood lookout for some time, but we never saw anything. Things escalated, though, immediately after that second screech. My husband unlocked the front door to walk down the gravel driveway with a high-powered flashlight to go and check the perimeter. And about 2 minutes after he had stepped into the dark, my 8-year-old daughter grabbed my shirt, trembling. "Mummy, why is Daddy doing that through the window?" I turned toward the front door. Standing right on the porch step was a shape, with my husband's exact height, build, and clothes. But his posture was completely wrong. His chin was sort of pinned flat against his chest. His eyes were rolled up, looking at me through his eyebrows, and his hand was rapidly scratching against the solid wood door. Thinking that he was just pulling some stupid, badly timed prank to break the tension, I rolled my eyes and walked back to the kitchen. When my husband walked through the front door 5 minutes later, my daughter immediately asked him why he was acting so weird on the porch. He stopped dead, totally confused. "What are you talking about? I've been out at the main utility gate 300 yards away for at least the last 5 minutes. I've spent years trying to get him to admit that it was an elaborate joke, but he completely denies it. Even that night, while our daughter was having a massive hour-long panic attack over it, he swore on his life that he never went near that porch. The next night, the physical interference moved even closer. I was standing on the back deck when a bunch of small, heavy stones were hurled from the roofline right past my left temple, hitting the wooden deck with a lot of force. At the exact same time, the high-pitched screeching started up again out in the tree line. Assuming that one of our weekend guests had snuck outside to mess with us, I marched down the deck stairs to catch them. My daughter came with me into the gravel yard, and we tracked a dark shape moving toward our parked pickup truck. When she leaned down to look under the chassis, she froze. One of our close friends was lying perfectly flat on his back on the gravel, right under the engine. He was completely motionless, his eyes wide open and staring blankly at the underside of the truck. I called his name over and over again, telling him to get up, but he just didn't move a muscle. He didn't blink, twitch, or say a word. What made it truly impossible, though, was that the high-pitched screeching sound was blasting from the air right next to his head, and he didn't even seem to flinch. Terrified by how catatonic he was, we quickly left the truck and ran back into the house. 10 minutes later, we found that exact same friend walking up the lower path from the woods, laughing and talking casually. We all went inside together. As we walked into the kitchen, that same friend stepped out of the basement door. His hair and clothes were completely soaked with water, and he slipped on the tiles, wiping out hard. I snapped at him immediately. That is exactly what you get for pulling that garbage under the truck outside. He sat up on the floor, totally clueless. What truck? I've been downstairs in the hot tub for the last 45 minutes. None of the 9 other people in the house had seen him leave the basement or walk past the kitchen, even though the only way in or out was through the single door where we were all watching. Both my husband and our friend haven't budged on their stories for 7 years at least, and neither of them seemed to be responsible for what we saw those days. A few months later, too, while clearing out some old brush near the porch, my husband found a weird sort of thing hidden right against the foundation. Tucked into a gap in the stone siding was an old heavy iron logging chain. It hadn't just fallen there. The chain was actually tightly wrapped in thick layers of coarse matted human hair, mixed with old grease or something, all bound tightly together with heavy copper wire. We pulled it out and we burned it, wanting it gone. The property, it's been completely unstable ever since that weekend. On top of everything, the acreage has been under constant aggressive territorial harassment by a massive black bear that tries to smash through the kitchen windows at the exact time every single day, basically. I don't let my daughter out on the deck after sunset anymore. This has only been happening for the last month or so, but again, it's just another one of those weird things that happens here. Whatever that sound is, though, and the mimics that we see from time to time, well, I just hope that it all ends soon, otherwise I don't know if I can live here permanently. So, I'm going to give some information about my bedroom and the house and how it's all set up, so that everything else will make a little more sense. But my room is set up like a square. My bedroom door is tucked in the bottom right corner, with my bed up against the opposite corner, with the foot of the bed facing towards the top of the square. In the front of the square, there are 2 windows at the foot of my bed, with maybe a yard of wiggle room so I can walk to my door. Last year was really rough for me though, and my room was incredibly messy, so the only way that I could get to my door was to hop off the foot of the bed and walk past both windows to leave my room. Under the 2 windows in my room is a small roof covering a room from the first floor. The roofing extends a foot past the room's wall on all sides, and there's no way to get to this roof unless you went through my windows. There's also no way to get on top of the house, at all. No trees, no fence, no ladders, nothing. Now last year, I was up late at night listening to music. It was almost 12 in the morning and it was completely dark outside, with the only light in my room being from a terrible lamp that I've had since I was a kid. In order for me to be able to sleep, I have to have my fan on, otherwise I'll pretty much overheat guaranteed and be really uncomfortable. Because my fan is always on, sometimes loose papers on my floor will sort of flap around, so I'll just get up and move them so I don't have to listen to it. This night, though, I heard a noise that didn't sound like paper coming from the foot of my bed. I was sort of confused and paused my music to listen. It got louder and I looked to where the noise was coming from. There was nothing on the ground, but when I looked up, a visceral fear that I've never felt before suddenly ran through me. At first, I genuinely thought it was a dog outside of my window, or a fox, but it was too unnatural. It was peeking into my window, and I could see its head and its pure white, unblinking eyes. That creature was the thing causing the noise, which I realized was scratching on the metal mesh outside of my window. We stared at each other, and this thing was huge. The creature started walking along both of my windows, scratching along the metal until it disappeared off to the side. Its back looked similar to a porcupine almost. I can't even describe it, to be honest. It was just sharp and it looked dangerous and made my breath hitch. I waited a few minutes, and thinking it was gone, I started inching towards the foot of my bed so that I could get the heck out of my room. It walked back across though, scratching the mesh, before sitting at the window in front of me and just staring at me. It paced between my windows for a bit, before walking off to the side and disappearing, keeping those wide eyes on me the entire time. Once I knew it was gone, I kept my eyes on the window at all times and backed out of the room. I sprinted down the hall to tell my parents, who were very disinterested, and, well, that was that. I walked back into my room and kept the lights on as I cried, and I just stared at my windows. I've slept with my lamp on since then, too. Now, a few months later, I had to move schools, and that's where I met Allie. We bonded pretty quickly and became really good friends. 7 months into our friendship, she opened up to me about her paranormal experience and how she thinks that she has some things that follow her around. She told me a lot of stories, but the last one, it made me stop. Allie started complaining about this dog that she's seen a few times across her life, and how it freaks her out. Before then, I had never told anyone about the creature that I saw outside of my window, but she described it perfectly. After she finished, I opened up about how I saw the exact same thing, and since then, I've been trying to help her with her spiritual attachments. I've always dealt with paranormal stuff, and I'm a very spiritual person, so nothing usually phases me. I've been dragged out of my bed by the leg when a spirit was mad at me. I've been woken up in the middle of the night by a spirit trying to talk to me. Sometimes I can see like auras, I guess you could say, around people. But this was a rare occasion that something genuinely freaked me out. Allie is dealing with some demonic stuff, I guess you could say. Like, I'm talking scary demonic stuff. She lives on native land and has dealt with some of their supernatural creatures before. And my town also has Native American roots, which makes me wonder if the dog could be something native. Maybe it was scoping me out before I met her, since I've helped her manage the supernatural stuff in her life or something. I really don't have any clue as to why it appeared, but if anyone has any insight, then please do let me know. Something reminded me of this incident that happened a few years ago at a friend's apartment, and I thought that I would share it. So back before COVID, around 2019 or so, I went to a party that my friend, 19 and female, was throwing at her place. No occasion or anything, we were just looking for a reason to get drunk, really. Anyways, I showed up and it was a small group, maybe 5 other people, mostly guys. We're all having a good time. A few hours go by, and as we're chatting in the living room, I hear a knock on the balcony fence. For context, they were on the ground floor level, and their apartment was on the far corner of the property downtown in our city. We ignore it and continue on. Another knock follows soon after, and when we go to the balcony, we can't see anyone over the fence. We're all a bit confused, and we've turned the music down by this point, and another knock comes. Only this time, on one of the windows, and then again on the windows beside that one. It's getting closer to the front door until finally this person is knocking on the front door. When the peephole is checked, however, you can't actually see them, which means that they're either ducking down or hiding. So all of the guys tell us to get behind them, and they're going to confront whoever is doing this. They grabbed whatever kitchen knives they could. I think someone had a broomstick too, which was a bit comical, but they busted out the front door. Me and the other girls followed behind, and to our horror, we see a single, very tall, skinny man crouched underneath the staircase with his right hand stuffed into his jacket pocket. His eyes looked yellow and bloodshot, and he immediately started to take off. The guys caught up and started questioning him, and he makes up some story about looking to get a haircut. They tell him to get out of here, and eventually he does. In all of that commotion, too, I noticed that he had left behind an envelope that was covered in glitter. It was empty, but sealed and covered in blue and purple glitter, and my friend's car had the same blue and purple glitter sitting on the hood. We think that he must have assumed that she lived there alone, and was going to bait her to open the door so that he could force his way inside. She lived at the apartment with her boyfriend, actually, but he didn't have a job, so he never left. To any onlookers, you'd only see her leave every day. And thank goodness she moved apartments not soon after that, and nowadays she's doing much better. But yeah, I really don't know what would have happened had there not been all of us there that night. I really hope that I never see that dude again, because the way that he was sitting there crouched up like that, it still haunts me. It wasn't in a passive sitting position or anything. Honestly, it was like he was ready to spring into action. So I was just 4 years old, and my parents had just moved my family into our first house. They decided to have a big family sleepover in the living room with my cousins, aunts, and uncles, and I remember that night that we watched Harry and the Hendersons, which was quite scary for me as a 4-year-old. And after the movie, we all went to bed. I remember this night really clearly too. It's possibly one of my earliest memories, in fact. But a cartoon girl woke me up. Her blonde hair and pink dress is still vivid in my mind to this day. She was holding a paint bucket and a ridiculously large paintbrush. She asked me to come outside with her because she wanted to paint some things. So I followed her out the front door. No one in my family woke up or noticed, by the way. The girl led me out to my father's truck parked on the side of the house. For context, I was a very small child and my dad's truck was tall and lifted. But there's no possible way that I could get in on my own, or even reach the door handle to open it. I always needed to be picked up to get into it, and I also rarely ever rode in it. So technically, I wouldn't have been familiar with how to get in it myself. And well, anyway, she opened the truck door and then set her paint bucket on the ground for me to stand on to get into the truck. Also, yes, my dad didn't have his truck locked. We kind of lived in a neighborhood out in the middle of a bunch of farmland. My dad seems to think that nothing can happen out there, so he doesn't care to lock his truck or pretty much anything. Anyway, I don't know exactly what happened after I got on the truck, but I remember being locked in there and watching the cartoon girl walk away. Once I was alone, I was absolutely petrified. I felt like I was being watched, and I remember being horrified about that Bigfoot Harry from the movie coming out to get me. So I did what any 4-year-old would do, and I freaked the heck out. Luckily, my dad was working in the garage that night after everyone had gone to bed, and I guess I was screaming and crying loud enough that he had heard me from inside the garage. He ran inside the house and saw the front door wide open, still everyone asleep. So he then ran outside because, well, it sounds like I was being kidnapped, but he found me inside of the truck. It's still a huge mystery in my family to this day on how exactly I was able to get into that truck. My dad checked everywhere too, and there was just nothing that I would have been able to climb on to get inside, let alone even open the door. And it's been unexplained all these years. Ever since then, I have had countless paranormal encounters, and they seem to follow me around. But hey, it's kind of a cool story to tell when I want to spook anyone, so I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoy sleeping outside, and I have a tent in the back corner of my yard up against the woods. Usually around midnight, I go to bed and I step outside and my motion light brightens up the yard as I walk about 40 yards to my tent. I'll be on Reddit or listening to an audiobook, YouTube, Netflix, whatever. And the first night that I was out there after setting up my new tent, I was relaxing when I heard a scratching near the door of my tent. Haha, very funny, good one. Now let me sleep, I said. Then off a bit in the distance, I hear both my teenage sons laughing. The next night, I hear coyotes very close. They frequent the high-tension lines just up the hill, and I hear them often, but This time it sounded like it was happening in my backyard, so I sat up, shut off my audiobook, and hit the record on my phone. It was pretty awesome and gave me chills just because it sounded so close. I could hear each individual coyote. It sounded like they were sort of attacking one of the pack, but anyway, the next night I hear them again, but much further away, and an owl who hauntingly hoots most nights. Later that night I hear scratching again, and tell them to go away as it must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning, perhaps even later. I fall asleep eventually, and same again the next night, but by now I know it wasn't my kids. I told them to stop the first time, and me having terminal cancer now, they do what I tell them. Some nights going to my tent as well, I see rabbits in my yard eating grass. Nocturnal rabbits? I don't know, but we have raccoons, opossums, squirrels, flying squirrels, fisher cats, and many others. I figured that something was brushing against my tent every night while grazing or whatever, but one night it was so loud and sounded so deliberate that I sat up and turned on my electric lantern and looked towards the noise, and see my shoes bouncing up and down on the tent floor. I thought to myself, oh my goodness, it's mice this whole time, or a snake, something that was comfortable beneath my tent. But last night was different. You see, I hear scratching again, this time on the opposite side where there is no door, where I'm up against the woods. It was definitely not an animal too, as it was up much higher and repeated a pattern-like scratching, like a record so to speak. I say out loud to leave me alone as I slap the side of the tent with the back of my hand. I could either hear or feel footsteps on the wet grass because it moved away and brushed up against my head and arm and stopped there. I had this pressure against me and I didn't move because I was terrified. After about 15 seconds, I felt it slowly move away and stop probably a foot or two away from my tent. It was weird to hear myself say loudly, "The power of Christ compels you." I couldn't think of something better to say. It just came out and, well, it seemed to work. I wanted to go in the house, but I was too frightened to open my tent and break for the porch. So I turned my audiobook back on, but turned the volume all the way up, and somehow, eventually I fell asleep. Tonight, though, I'm sleeping in my bed, and tomorrow I will go through the video on a bird feed camera that might have caught something. Being a skeptic, I will assuredly make some more excuses on what it could have been, but I was so scared last night that now I think that perhaps one day, who knows, I may become a believer. I was just listening to other stories here, and I got a flashback to something abundantly strange that happened to me as a kid. I figured that I should share it here, otherwise, well, I'll probably forget it for like another 20 years again. So my parents took me and my brother camping. I guess the place is still there, Nelson's family campground along Halesbrook in East Hampton. My brother and I used to slip quarters in the arcade machines that they had in this log cabin-y sort of main office thing, and we loved it. The trip itself was, well, pretty uneventful really. Mum and Dad were nagging at each other and lightly fighting. Dad took us fishing at one point. We didn't catch anything and he was kind of being a bit of a jerk. My brother and I were in Scouts, so we were pretty familiar with the outdoors. We went fishing and camping all the time with our uncle, who took us on more backwoods kind of trips. So we thought that this would be a breeze for us. It's like 4 a.m. one of the nights that I've got to pee. I've pretty much seen it all, and the campground is safe, and all I've got to worry about is skunks and possums. I put on a jacket and crawl out of my tent and walk over to the bushes. I'm standing there, member in hand, and I see this animal head with glowing green eyes low in the bushes, about 20 feet out, maybe a foot or two from the ground. I assume it's a possum, so I start to pee. And then I remember thinking, wow, that possum actually really looks like an alien, but as if it was a giant bug. My eyes adjust and I expect a possum face to appear, but no, an alien, but sort of looked like a praying mantis. It kind of sinks in how strange it is. The eyes are glowing green like that and not yellow. like a bioluminescent sort of thing and not a reflection. I recall it reminded me of fireflies at the time, and then my eyes actually adjust, and I see that not only am I right, but I also see that it has long, spindly arms. It's laying there in a position like it was doing push-ups. Its otherworldly and strangely long arms are bent at the elbow, which when bent, sit higher than its head. It sort of looked like a long letter M, I guess. I kind of digest all of this, as it were. I'm not dreaming, so I should probably panic, but I realize that if it's an alien, that they're only like 3 or 4 feet tall according to law, so I don't really care. I mean, I'll kick its butt, right? But then it stands up. Well, the head elevates, the arms straighten, and maybe it's just a human after all and some gangly creep. But the head keeps elevating. It would have had to have been 9 or 10 feet tall by the time that it was done standing up. I was just frozen there trying to tell myself how not real this was or the millions of things that it could be. Then I realize, no, what I'm seeing is what I'm getting. I'm looking at exactly what I think I'm looking at. I'm like 20 feet from this 10-foot tall mantis alien with glowing green eyes, and it's just me and him. Finally, I scream like my life depended on it, because it probably did. And then just everything kind of gets, well, hazy. I remember making it to the tent and hiding in my sleeping bag, and my brother reacting frantically. My parents are upset that I woke up the whole campground, and I tell them what happened. They walk over to where it was and see that it would have for sure been a few feet taller than adults, and I feel like I'm about to be sick. Meanwhile, I'm expecting a long, gangly arm to dart out of the brush and snag one of them. Thankfully, that never happened, but still, I was absolutely freaking out. I want to believe that it was a dream or a night terror, but my brother harassed me about it for a good 10 years before, well, unfortunately, he died. I guess the most unsettling part of it all was just how confident this thing was, like I was just inconsequential to it, and it was observing me with what I would describe as disdain. I was just this gross nothing to it, like it could eat me, but thank you, no thank you sort of thing. I don't know why I felt that way, but I distinctly remember that, and the whole event is not something that I think about that often, but like I said, my memory was jogged by another story, and so I thought that I would share this. A little while ago, I heard a chair move in the other room. I looked over and saw that it looked like the chair had been pulled out from under the table. I felt a bit weird about that, but I blamed it on the cat and went back to decorating my MySpace page. Yeah, I was like 13 at the time. About an hour later, I heard the chair move again though, and this time it was facing me. Again, I tried to blame it on the cat, but that's when I noticed that the cat was above me, on the printer, soundly asleep, and had obviously been there for quite some time. When I realized that, I had the craziest chill run up my spine, because we didn't have any other pets, and if something was in that chair, it was sitting there, and seemingly looking at me. I was so freaked out I ran into my sister's room and hid under her blankets. She didn't wake up but was really confused why I was in her bed in the morning. When I told her what had happened, she said that she had seen the ghost in the house too. Apparently, one night she woke up and saw a tall man in a cowboy hat standing at the end of her bed. In that moment, she thought that she was going to die and hid her face under the blanket, but nothing happened for so long, so she eventually looked and the man was gone. This was my mum's husband's house, and apparently he'd had multiple priests and mediums come through, and they all said the same thing, that there are 3 spirits in his house, and apparently one is a cowboy, the other is an old woman, and the third is an indigenous man. I don't know which one was messing with the chair that night, but I am super glad that I never saw the cowboy at the foot of my bed. I'm 16 now, and I've been dealing with something terrifying for as long as I can remember. It all started when I was 5, and honestly, I still don't fully understand what's going on. I know that some people won't believe me, but I need to share this, get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there has gone through the same thing and will know what to do. So, it all began when my mum, who was a single parent at the time, met my stepdad. He was super nice, and eventually we moved into his house. My stepdad had a daughter who was 8 years older than me, and I shared a room with her, but she wasn't around much because she was already dating and out with friends a lot. The house was old, like built in the early 1900s, and I remember feeling a bit creeped out almost immediately. At first, it was just nightmares. I was scared of the dark at the time, so I used to sleep in my stepsister's bed because it was closer to the hallway light. But every time that I slept in her bed, I had this awful nightmare where something chased me, trying to hurt me. I was only 5, so I didn't think much of it and just stopped sleeping in her bed. But then the nightmares started happening in my own bed too. It wasn't every night, but often enough to scare me. I couldn't really explain it to anyone because, honestly, who's going to believe a little kid saying that they're haunted? Over time, though, things got weirder. By the time that I was 7, we redecorated the room, and I started noticing, shadows moving at night and hearing random old-timey music. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see shadows standing in the corner or behind the door. One night I woke up, but instead of being in my room, it felt like I was in my grandparents' old living room. It was completely empty, and even though I knew that I was awake, I couldn't see my room at all until I bumped my head on the door. That was when I started to seriously freak out, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought that they would just brush it off. By the time that I was around 9, though, I became convinced that it was the spirit of the old woman who used to live in the house. The reason for this is that the only owner before us was a 96-year-old woman who died in a retirement home, and I thought that her spirit had stayed behind. I'd see her shadow standing in the corner of the room where my stepsister's bed used to be, or I'd feel something pulling at my feet while I slept. Sometimes I'd see her standing behind the door, just a silhouette through the glass. I never really saw her face or anything, but I was convinced that it was her. I got to the point where I got used to her presence. I wasn't exactly comfortable with it, but it became a part of my life, I guess. That is, until things got worse. Her presence started to feel, more aggressive, I would say. She'd move around more, and her shadow looked less human, taller, skinnier, and somehow more threatening. The nightmares, they became more intense, and I could feel her in other parts of the house, not just in my room anymore. I'd hear footsteps on the stairs, like someone was walking around late at night, and the whole house just felt very off. This went on until I was about 10, and that's when I told my aunt about what I was going through, and she convinced my mum to have a priest come and bless the house. And weirdly enough, after that, everything stopped. For 2 years, no nightmares, no shadows, no weird noises, nothing. It was a huge relief for me at the time as well. But then, when I was about 12, my dog died, and everything started up again. I'd see my dog lying on my parents' bed, even though he was gone. Sometimes I'd hear something eating from his food bowl, even though our other dog was nowhere near it. And once, our kitchen clock, which had been hanging on the wall for years, randomly fell off and rolled all the way to my dog's food bowl. This time, even my parents noticed the weird things happening, but eventually they just sort of pretended like it wasn't real. They'd say that I was imagining things, or that I was just overthinking it. Then, when I was 14, I invited a friend over for a sleepover one night. She believed me when I told her about the haunting because she said that she could see spirits. We decided to set up an experiment to see if we could catch anything on camera. We put cameras in the room, and the next morning we actually found something. There was a dark shadow lying between us in the bed, completely still like it was dead. The camera stopped recording at 3:30 in the morning, but what we saw freaked us both out. I showed the footage to my parents, hoping that they'd finally take me seriously, but they just made me delete it. I wanted to send it to someone who knew about this stuff, but they wouldn't let me. After that, things went quiet again for a couple of years, and genuinely I thought that maybe it was all over at this stage. But 6 months ago, everything started up again, and this time it's way worse. I've been dealing with depression for the past year, and somehow that seems to have triggered the activity again. The shadows are back, the noises, the feeling of being watched, everything. A few nights ago, I heard my brother's voice calling my name at 1:30 in the morning saying, "Come take a quick look," or something to that effect. But it didn't sound right. It was his voice, but it was like a recording maybe. Then it switched to my dad's voice saying the exact same thing. I didn't respond, and I'm glad that I didn't. I think that it feeds on fear, and I think it gets stronger with that or something. I'm going to see a medium tomorrow. Unfortunately, my best friend moved abroad, so I can't really ask her for help anymore. I don't know what this thing is or why it's attached to me, but I really, really need some answers. If you're going through something like this, please don't ignore it. Find someone who can help, whether it's a priest, a medium, or someone who understands. Don't let other people's disbelief stop you either. I'll keep you guys updated after I meet with the medium, but please, do wish me luck. This story dates back to spring of 2016. At the time, I was in my late 20s. I was young and fit with very long blonde hair. A total hippie chick that had quit her job to travel the US with my ex at the time, pre-pandemic before the van life or tiny home movement really took off. We left our home in the Midwest of January that year, after holiday celebrations saying goodbye to friends and family. By sometime in April or early May, we made it to southern Texas and decided to check out Padre Island National Seashore. For those of you unfamiliar with the location, it's a seashore that you can drive right onto with your vehicle. My now ex and I were in a 26-foot Class C 1976 Chevy motorhome. We drove into the island at nighttime, and waking up the next morning was the most insane and phenomenal experience. The ocean was a mere 15 feet away. I mean, the visual was absolutely breathtaking. I'll never forget it. We arrived on a Thursday or Friday, and the beach was beyond packed. Another thing for people unfamiliar with Padre is that it was where many Texans, high schoolers and college kids mainly, flock for their spring break. And spring break was just the week prior to when we got there, or maybe still going on. Either way, what I mean is that it was busy, and we had an awesome weekend partying away. During this weekend, we noticed that workers for the park would often drive down the beach. They're pretty protective of their sea turtle population there and would slowly drive by in marked vehicles a few times a day. And by Monday morning, we woke up to find the entire island emptied out. When I tell you that we were literally the only ones, both when you looked left or right, we were the only ones for what seemed like miles. It was a gorgeous morning too, so I walked the dog quickly and then came inside to sit at our pop-up dining room table to do some journaling. My ex was asleep on the very back couch. We were backed in with the windshield facing the ocean, so of course I took a seat looking towards the beautiful view. Maybe 15 minutes after I sat down to journal, a grey beat-up pickup truck drove by, kind of quickly, headed towards the direction of the park entrance. That was the first activity I'd seen on the island that morning, and I didn't think anything of it. However, maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, the same truck came driving back past our RV, this time much slower. The man driving the pickup was going so slow, in fact, that we made eye contact for several seconds as he went back by. He also seemed to drive closer to our vehicle in order to better see inside. Alarm bells should have been ringing at this point, but I kind of just shrugged it off. I was very much in my free spirit phase and was not easily off-put. And this is where it gets really creepy. So obviously, this guy needed to turn back around since he was driving away from the park entrance again. But I was honestly minding my own business. I kind of put him out of mind. But yes, several minutes later, the man came back. But this time, he pulled directly up to our RV with his truck, essentially nose to nose at a 45-degree angle, to appear as if he were giving us a jump. Not far-fetched for a 70s vehicle on the salty beach, but he was blocking us in. It was now that my heart dropped and I began to get a bit scared. I screamed my ex's name immediately and he jumped up from the couch. I know that he could hear the panic in my voice, but I'll never forget just how quickly he got up and how he had his arms spread across while he ducked down to see through the windshield. He was 6'5", very bearded, and I'm 1,000% sure that he was the only reason that the man in the grey beat-up truck sped off like he did. It took several minutes for my heart rate to return to normal. My ex and I just looked at each other, because that was the most unusual encounter on our trip yet. Surprisingly, we stayed another week after that, in the same spot as well. The idea never entered my head that the man could bring reinforcement and come back for me or us. I was very foolishly fearless and naive back then, I know. Anyway, it wasn't until later that day that another fact dawned on me. When my ex and I had arrived over the weekend, we only pulled out one camping chair. That one camping chair was in plain sight next to our RV outside. Prior to this spot, we had never done that. We always got both chairs out. But we ended up using driftwood to sit on when we had our bonfires there. And so that was the nail in the coffin for me. The scary man in the grey truck absolutely thought that I was a young girl all alone. And I still wonder to this day, almost 10 years later, what all he had in mind for me that morning. Also, out of curiosity, I googled Padre Island National Seashore Murder, and it looks like a murder of an RV couple occurred there back in 2019, which honestly gives me chills. I would like to start by saying that I know that this story sounds crazy. I know it sounds made up. I could write a book off of the things experienced in this house. I didn't believe in ghosts until, well, I went through this experience, and even now I struggle to find my sanity when retelling it. My family and I all question our sanity while going through it, but I can assure you that this story is 100% true, and honestly I wish that I was making it up. I am not the only person who experienced things too. In the following story, I'll give you the perspectives and experiences of myself, 13 to 16 years old when it all happened, my mother, who was a widow, my younger sister, 1 to 3 when it happened, her name is Polly, my now stepfather, Mark, my stepbrother, 13 to 16 years old when it happened, Nick, a religious family member, Tina, a woman who stayed with us for a few days, Katie, my sister's godmother, Jen, the ghost hunters, and our priest. Again, I know that this is going to sound pretty absurd, and so it's hard to know where to start, but I'll start before the haunting. So when I was about 12, my mum married a really great man named Ron. This was the classic tale of a blended family. I was my mum's only child, and my stepdad had 2 sons of his own, one slightly older and one slightly younger than I was. And shortly after getting married, they had my younger sister, Polly. Ron was super fun and the ideal stepdad. Imagine a kid trapped in an adult body. The only thing that I didn't like about Ron, well, his family and his church. His family was super dysfunctional and toxic. His kids were, like, real bad, and I hated being around them. I'll get to more of this later, but he didn't have custody and was trying to get it. His church was also very different from what I was used to. I grew up Catholic. I'm not sure what he was, but at his church, the service would take hours, and there would be people barefoot in the aisles, randomly shouting out, speaking in tongues throughout the whole production. Nothing wrong with that, I guess, but if you're a Catholic and have ever been to this kind of church, it's a very different experience. We didn't go to this church often, but after my sister was born, he wanted to go a lot more. Now, there was this one very old sweet lady at this church who would always come up and say hi to my mum and the new baby. We didn't know her well, and she would be the first odd experience that we would have. You see, one day my mum, Ron, baby Polly, stepbrothers and myself all went to this church. The older woman came up to us and, instead of her typical upbeat, happy demeanor, she seemed very concerned and pulled my mum aside from the group. She warned my mum that she could see and sense a very, very dark, evil, powerful energy attached to Ron's family. She said that she could see it already affecting him and his boys, and warned my mum that she needed to get my sister and myself away to keep us safe. This woman was very concerned, but obviously my mum just sort of brushed the whole situation off as just a crazy lady thing. His kids kept getting worse though. All sorts of things, like one tried to kill his grandfather, theft, vandalism, all sorts of stuff. So they weren't allowed to come around as often. Simultaneously, my stepdad began to get cranky, sluggish, and a bit weird. I even started feeling very uncomfortable around him, and disconnected. This all came to a head shortly after my sister turned 1. Unfortunately, my stepdad, he ended his own life, and I was the one who found his body. We had no warning. In hindsight, I could see changes in his behavior, but none that could have made us think that this was coming. He left a note to my mum and sister, literally, deeply, sloppily scratched into the wood on the top of a desk in the same room. Very rushed and not at all in the right state of mind. My mum, she went into a months-long state of shock, not eating, not talking, barely able to make eye contact. We moved out of the house in with my grandparents temporarily, and this is where things started getting weird. My mum was the first to have these little experiences. She claims that she could just feel Ron's presence with her when she would rock Polly to sleep or hang out in Polly's nursery. She would think that she would accidentally hear Ron, sort of behind her, or catch a glimpse of him in the corner of her eye or something. But then she started smelling his cologne, clear as day, regularly. Eventually, my mum bought a house for us to move into. On the day of closing, she slept in the house on her own the first night. She claims to this day that she knew everything would be okay because she felt his presence there so strongly and could smell his cologne everywhere in the house. She spent the whole first night crying, but feeling reassured that she was going to give us a great life. And Ron's presence was apparently a great comfort to her. It really all started as these very minor, some could even say positive or comforting, experiences. It wasn't until the first majorly weird experience. So months after moving in, my mum was heading home with Polly from daycare. Polly does not remember Ron and at the time did not know that he had died. One day, as my mum and Polly are heading home, Polly, maybe 2 years old now, says to my mum that she doesn't want to go home. My mum obviously asks why, and Polly responds, because that's where Daddy is, and Daddy is sad. My mum is silent. Polly continues, Daddy can't breathe, his throat hurts, Daddy is choking, and starts making choking noises in the back seat. My mum absolutely loses it, and speeds home. She immediately tells me, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know about all that. But it was hard not to believe her when hearing the panic and the fear in her voice. We didn't live there long until I started experiencing things as well. The house is a historic home and had cold spots, I guess you could say. Not, oh, the windows are cold in this room, so it's cooler type of spots, but I mean significant drop-offs in temperature by 15 to 20 degrees in those areas at least. The cold spots? Well, number 1, my sister's playroom on the first floor of the living room. The second, my bedroom closet only, upstairs. And the third, my sister's bedroom, upstairs. Now, my first experiences were also minor. Like, I'd open my closet to get changed in the morning and get hit with like a burst of cold air daily. My mum and I would be hanging in the living room, and toys in my sister's playroom would regularly go off on their own. Most often it was this riding horse toy that you had to sit on, and it would sing this song, like I'm a happy horse or something. Toys going off and the occasional bump in the night eventually turned into the faint sounds of footsteps, though, in the upstairs hallway. We chalked all these things up to just having an old house and it being normal to hear some creaks and bumps occasionally. We would also hear my sister talking to someone in the middle of the night in her room. She had this framed picture collage in her room from her dad Ron's funeral service. It was a bunch of pictures of the family, and we would hear her talking to someone saying who all the people were. Like, this is my sissy, that's my daddy, this is mummy, etc. We set up voice recorders and caught it happening, and when we asked who she was talking to, she always said putt-putt. Our dog would also randomly start barking and growling at nothing in the house. Typically it was in the living room towards the stairs. But things really got so much worse though. My mum, she started dating Mark. Mark was my best friend's dad, and he lived down the street and worked midnights. Mark would come over to the house every now and then, and we always noticed that activity would ramp up a bit while he was there and shortly after he left, but we didn't think too much of it. Still just minor things after all. I did local theatre in high school, and there was a girl in my cast, Katie, who came into rehearsal one day covered in bruises. Katie was a little bit older, but we found out that Katie's husband had been hitting her and she really needed someplace to stay until things would calm down. My mum is a DV survivor herself, so this tugged at her heartstrings, and she told Katie that she didn't have a choice. She was coming to stay with us temporarily. My mum was worried Katie's abusive husband would show up at the house, so she asked Mark to start staying over. Keep in mind though that Mark worked midnights, so during the day it was only him and Katie. But after Mark moved in, that was when things really took off. Katie stayed for a few days and then she suddenly left. It was a very hasty leave, and we wouldn't find out until later that she left because she was terrified of being alone in our house. She said that she would hear things, see figures out of the corner of her eye, and felt a very heavy or negative energy in the house. She also said that she felt like she wasn't alone and was being watched. She asked if our house was haunted, and we just sort of laughed at the idea. But then Mark started having experiences, a lot of them too. Mark is a very vivid dreamer, and according to him, he started having some of the worst, messed up, violent, even sadistic nightmares that he had ever had in his life in our house. Some of them are so sad that to this day, he won't even tell us what happened in the dreams. Eventually, he shared with us one particular dream and said that Ron came to him and was really upset. He had met Ron previously, maybe once at like a school function, but in this dream, Ron was yelling at him, telling him that it was extremely important that he find Tonya. Mark asked who the heck Tonya was, and my mum and I's mind were blown. Tonya was one of Ron's sisters. They were not close, and Mark never met her or knew about her. Yet he kept saying that it was really important that we contacted Tonya. The next dream Mark tells us about had us questioning all the happenings around the house even more, because apparently Ron became a regular in Mark's dreams, getting increasingly more angry and violent with each dream appearance. In the last dream, Ron was losing his mind at Mark about some sort of RC car and how he needed it, and Mark had to find it. My mum and I had no idea what he was talking about, so we contacted Ron's old best friend. The old best friend knew exactly what we were talking about, because apparently Ron had a little RC electric car that he'd always take apart and put back together to make it faster. Eventually it just went into a box, I guess, in the basement, and my mum and I never knew about it. The car was actually before our time in his life. The best friend asked how we knew about it though, and was pretty shocked to find out that it was via my mum's new boyfriend's dream. The incidents only increased in frequency and severity too, Bangs, loud footsteps, sounds of running, feeling of not being alone, cold spots even colder, etc. Mark moved in full time though, and Polly's behaviour took a turn for the worst at this point. Polly quickly lost the tiny amount of emotional regulation toddlers have. She threw tantrums constantly, would hit, scream, throw, and bite over the tiniest things. Her lying went through the roof, and we figured that these were things being learned at daycare or something. She completely stopped sleeping in her own bedroom because she hated that room. In fact, just walking into the room with her would lead to a complete meltdown. She would occasionally sleep in my bed with me, but I told my mum that I couldn't do it any longer because every time she slept in my room with me, I had a very weird and very violent dream. So she started sleeping with my mum instead. Other than the weird dreams, bad behaviour and car incident, the first truly odd experience with Polly would be with her and the missing apple. Polly loved fruit and ate apples regularly. We had a finished basement that was rarely used because it felt weird down there, but we had some of her larger toys down there stored away. One day we gave Polly an apple for a snack, and later that night remembered that we didn't get it from her to throw it away. My mum got super paranoid about bugs and it going bad, so she asks Polly where is the apple. Now, Polly had this tent thing that she played in the basement, and she would always tell us that Jesus lived in her tent in the basement. But we just said, okay, and just rolled with it sort of thing. But when we asked where the apple was, she told us that she was hanging out with Jesus in her tent, and the bad kids came. No clue who the bad kids are, but she would also tell us that there were bad kids in the basement. Remember the bad kids for later. Polly, though, was adamant that either the bad kids took her apple, or that Jesus gave the bad kids her apple. We searched the house and the garbage can from top to bottom like 1,000+ times, and, well, we just never found that apple. Polly is 13 now and still says that she remembers the bad kids in the basement, and is still adamant that they took her apple. My mum practically interrogated her about it as a kid. But whenever she would be bad, she'd always blame the bad kids and say that they told her to do it, or that she didn't do it and it was all of them. Her behavior, though, kept getting worse, until she eventually would get so upset about something that she would start screaming and biting herself until she even drew blood. This is obviously not normal for a toddler. Keep in mind this new habit too, because this only gets crazier. A side experience my stepbrother, Nick or Mark's son, had soon after that also included the basement. He didn't live with us, but he had a key and he would come and go. He was not fully aware of any of the things happening in the house at this time, but he was coming over to hang out, and we were still out running errands. He said that he would just wait for us inside, and he swears on his life that when he walked inside, he clearly heard my mum's voice calling for something from the basement, and heard what he described as kids. He went down to look for them, and then called me to ask where we were. I obviously said that we were still out and asked why, and he was adamant that he thought that he had heard us. Well, while down there apparently, he felt the need to go to the toilet, because what story would it be without my brother going to the bathroom? But anyway, he didn't want to make the main bathroom smell, so he used the basement bathroom since he was already down there anyway. And he claims that right after getting off of the phone with me and being mid-business, he heard a child laugh right behind him, and it absolutely terrified him. According to him, he has never jumped off of a toilet so quickly. Now, we had been living in this house for maybe a year at this point, and the experiences were only getting more frequent and, well, pretty much undeniable. The footsteps, the toys, the cold spots, the sounds, the dreadful feeling. Making excuses for the things happening around us was getting to be pretty difficult at this stage. Polly is being bad, nobody is getting any sleep. We were frustrated, exhausted, and drained mentally, emotionally, and physically. And I think that's when whatever we were dealing with, it took advantage of us the most. Polly Started having night terrors regularly, very different from a nightmare, and also started sleepwalking too. You would find her standing in the doorway of her room, standing right above the stairs, standing somewhere in your room, or you'd wake up to her standing at the side of your bed, which always terrified me. But mostly we were afraid of her getting hurt. At the same time, the sounds of heavy footsteps upstairs became regular. And I remember one night my mum had put Polly to sleep up in her bed, and Mark, my mum and I were still sitting in the living room just watching a movie, when clear as day, we heard someone absolutely booking it down the upstairs hallway. We give each other that look, and my mum says, heck no, she's going to check that. We needed to make sure Polly wasn't sleepwalking though, so somehow they convinced me, the teenager, to go upstairs and check on my sister. And there she is, fast asleep on my mum's bed, certainly not sprinting through the hall. Another memorable experience, though, was soon after my sister's 3rd birthday party. Mark, my mum and myself are just hanging out in the living room with Polly upstairs asleep, and we hear someone come barreling through the hallway and down the staircase. Stairs were on the left far side of the living room against the wall. At this point, the sound of footsteps has become such a normal occurrence that it doesn't even fully weird us out anymore. But this night was different. Polly had some helium balloons from her party in the doorway of her playroom, and as we're all sitting there, after hearing someone or something come down the stairs, I kid you not, we start seeing one singular helium balloon very slowly float from her playroom across the living room and up the stairs. I was absolutely astonished by this. None of us could believe what we had just seen. My mum went to get the balloon and found it halfway up the stairs on the landing. To this day, I still get goosebumps whenever I remember this moment. That was my first sighting, I guess you could say, but it certainly was not the last, and it wouldn't be long until we were seeing, well, figures. The first time I saw a figure was in the upstairs hallway. I never typically kept the lights off when moving around my house. You could turn the upstairs light on from the living room, and I hated the dark. My room was immediately at the top of the staircases, and my doorway was on the left-hand side. I was in a rush to grab something from my room, so I ran up the stairs with the light off, and that was when I saw him. Standing directly in front of me, in the hallway, was a man. Probably 6'5", I would guess, but it was early evening but still dark, and I remember thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me at first. I stared at him for a few seconds and felt the fear welling up inside of me. When I snapped out of it, I went to flip a light on, and he was standing directly next to the hallway's light switch. I was not about to move any closer toward him, so I reached my arm inside of my bedroom and quickly flicked the light on. And by the time that I had done that, he was gone, of which I never saw him again. 2 other people have had definite sightings in that house, Mark and my mum, and they also had a weird sound experience together. Mark had 2 sightings, and the first one may be my favorite of all the sightings, in fact. Like I said before, I did local theatre in high school, so sometimes I would get home pretty late at night. Mark, my mum and Polly are all in the master bedroom in bed when Mark says to my mum, I didn't know that they were home already. She must have just gotten in." My mum looks at him confused and says, "No, they just left for theatre. She'll be home in like 30 minutes. Mark is adamant, though, that I was already home because he swears up and down that he just saw me in the hallway outside the bedroom door. Almost like I leaned over and just peeked my head and part of my body inside of the room. Mark is so convinced, in fact, that he saw me that they call me, and I confirm that I'm not at home, but I am on my way home. When I get home, Mark thinks that we're messing with him and that I've been home the whole time. He has me in their doorway reenacting what he saw, and then he goes, no, it definitely wasn't you. You're not tall enough. Whatever I saw, it took up the whole doorway. Now, I'm not sure why Mark seemed to think that I was that tall, but it's consistent with my sighting of a very tall man or thing or something. Which leads to his next sighting, which was not nearly as exciting, I guess. We had one of those old school attics where you would pull down the string thing and the ladder falls from the ceiling. You know the one, right? But then you climb up and you lift that wicked heavy door at the top to get in. Well, we kept holiday decorations in the attic up there, and Mark says that when he opened the attic, he saw a tall dark figure bolt from his eyesight behind a stack of boxes. Upon seeing that, Mark just closed the attic door and he got the decorations down another time. Now, to my mum's sightings. She has always stuck to the same story as well, and it actually makes me believe her and also question what kind of mother that she was. Remember how I told you nobody was getting any sleep? Well, my mum was regularly waking up around the same time every night, and this turned into the tradition of her going downstairs for a glass of orange juice and going back up to bed and typically checking on us kids. We all sleep with our doors open, so she would just look in. Now, you'd walk up the stairs, and my bedroom was immediately on the top on the left side, like I said before, but the bathroom was across from my room on the right side, and Mum's room was at the end of the hallway on the left side. Polly's room was at the end of the hallway on the right side. And my mum, she claims up and down that she woke up in the middle of the night one night, flipped the hall light on, and headed towards the stairs for her regular orange juice. We had to put a baby gate up due to Polly's new sleepwalking habit, so she had to stop before the stairs to open it. And right when she reached the top of the stairs, something caught the corner of her eye, because she saw a tall black figure in my room, standing at the end of my bed, facing me. She stood there for a moment and looked at it, said to herself, "Nope, I'm half awake and delirious, it's not there." She goes downstairs and gets the orange juice, and upon walking back up, she says that she reaches the landing and, clear as day, sees the black figure run from my room, through the hallway and into my sister's room. Sister was not in her room, by the way. She says that it freaked her out so much that she just immediately ran to her room and just got back into bed. Thanks a lot, Mum, right? Anyway, around this time, my sister got very sick too and was miserable to sleep with, tossing and turning, burning up, all that. My mum and Mark, they were in bed watching TV with the dog. Polly had been put into her room for the first time in a very long time to see if we could get her to sleep there. Mark and my mum claim that as they were sitting there, they very clearly both heard, "Where is she?" spoken out loud. They looked at each other and immediately started trying to deny. Like, my mum asked Mark, "Did you hear that?" Mark says, "Hear what? The dog's stomach?" My mum says, "The dog's stomach? And what did the dog's stomach say, Mark?" Mark responds, "Where is she?" They then both freak out and run to my sister's room, grab her, and they put her back into bed with them. And here is where things, well, they took a bad turn. So, remember how nobody is sleeping or everyone is having issues with sleeping? Well, I had started to get really, really bad sleep paralysis. I had never gotten it before, but it became a regular occurrence. And one night in particular, I woke up, but I couldn't move. I was sleeping on my stomach, so half of my face or my right cheek was in the bed, and I remember knowing that I was dealing with sleep paralysis and needed to snap out of it. And I started to see the room around me or behind me glow red, and I could see shadows on the walls around me just out of sight. I heard two voices, neither of which I would describe as human. The first voice was on my left side and was very deep, guttural, almost growly, but repeating something over and over in a very rhythmic-like chant. It wasn't English, and it sounded like no language that I could recognize, other than maybe Latin, which we would hear at church sometimes. The other voice was higher, though, grainier, and sounded more agitated, I guess. It was like the higher voice was egging the lower voice on, and it also wasn't in English. was then that I felt the most insane, heavy pressure on my back pushing me down into the bed. I remember thinking how I knew that I was in sleep paralysis, how it was likely to be a dream even though it seemed so real. The harder it pushed me though, the more difficult it got to breathe while the rhythmic chanting only got louder. I remember starting to cry and genuinely thinking to myself that I was about to die. If you've never been in a situation where you genuinely thought that you would die, know that it's a feeling that it will never leave you. It sticks with you forever. Well, I tried to move and I remember straining to scream or just make some sort of noise, anything really, but I was stuck and just completely helpless. But whatever this thing was, it was going to kill me, and I began begging God in my head to save me. I'm not even religious, but here I was praying, when all at once, it just stopped. I remember feeling my heart pounding in my chest, and unlike other bouts of sleep paralysis that I had gotten, immediately after the chanting and the pressure had stopped, I could move. I never had to, wake up out of it, which was just so weird to me. The next morning, as I was getting ready for school, I was terrified and, well, eventually I broke down in tears telling my mum about what had happened as we got ready for the day. As I was changing my clothes that morning, she walked by my room and stops me, because I had scratches all over my back. Not deep ones and no bleeding, but red scratches all the way down my back. That same day, my mum gets a call from my little sister's godmother, Jen. Jen is a bit freaked out and says that she needed to call my mum to see if we were okay. My mum wants to know why she's asking, and Jen proceeds to tell her that the night before she woke up in the middle of the night to a tall, dark figure standing at the end of her bed. She felt frozen and immediately felt a deep sense of dread. She started feeling overwhelming pressure on her chest, pushing her into the bed. All she could think about at the time was our family, and she yelled out for it to leave her alone, and it disappeared. She apparently needed to call us and see that we were okay and what was going on. Mind you, she had no idea about my own experiences that night, or about any of the other things that were happening in the house. This was too much of a coincidence for me to just dismiss, and we couldn't rationalize it or explain it away. If it was just my own experience, we maybe could have made some excuses, but how the heck did Jen know? And also, what did Jen also see? And so, it was at this point that we knew that things were getting serious and that we really needed some help. My mum had friends that considered themselves amateur ghost hunters, I guess you could say. And when they'd heard about the things going on in the house, they were down my mum's throat about coming in to investigate. They set up cameras and recorders and, well, just all sorts of gear. We all had to leave for a weekend while they looked through the house, but I was just a young teenager, so I was not allowed to see all the findings. But my mum and Mark were there to see them, and they showed the findings to my grandparents. My grandfather is a big military war vet, a sort of no-nonsense guy, and he said the recordings gave him chills, and he never liked coming to our house because it always felt odd there. The most active room, though, apparently was Polly's room. Polly's room was an icebox and was pretty active, I would say. Every cross from the house was placed in her room, and we even had a rosary blessed by the Pope in there. We were not super religious people, but going through an experience like this, well, I can confirm that it makes you do some crazy things, I guess you could say. In Polly's room, though, they had heard a woman's voice humming over the recording. They even caught something moving the recorder around, and clear as day heard a male voice say, "What is this?" while moving the recorder. They caught toys going off in the playroom, and caught the doorknob on my bedroom closet jiggling at one point. They also asked if they could come in and do some more research, but my mum said no to this because things ramped up a bit in the house after that, and also Polly's behavior really spiked. We knew then that we needed some other help, a different form of help, I guess. We first reached out to a woman in our family, Tina, who was very involved in her church. Tina came over for the first time and immediately stopped when she came through that door. She put a hand to her chest and said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, but I just got the most overwhelming sense of my mum being here when I walked in." Her mother, she had passed away a few years prior and was a huge part of our overall family. It didn't dawn on us until that moment too that my cousins and I had a running joke growing up that we all had an imaginary friend named Mrs. Tut Tut, who lived with her, and she was responsible for taking care of. Now, remember the putt-putt person that Polly was talking to in her room at night, and then we caught the older woman humming in the room? Well, anyway, Polly's behavior was still getting worse, and it was starting to concern us. Tina asked when she came in if we would mind if she said a quick prayer over Polly. Polly was dead asleep on the couch, mind you. Tina walked over and sat on the couch next to her, put one hand over Polly and started saying a quick prayer. And I kid you not, Polly's eyes shot wide open. She immediately sat up on the couch and was thrashing around, kicking and crying and screaming that she wanted to go up to her room, take her to her room. As soon as Tina said Amen and stopped praying, Polly crashed back down onto the couch and was out like a light again. It was as if she never even woke up, in fact. We all sort of just stood there, looking at each other with eyes full of fear. I mean, how could we rationalize that? 4 people just witnessed it too. We really feared for Polly at that stage. We went to our church and we spoke to our priest. He listened to our stories and gave us advice. He told us that based off of what we were saying, he felt the entity was evil and we should not try and make contact. He had to assure my mum that this was not wrong. We should avoid discussing it in the house at all costs too. No talk of the devil or watching scary movies. A crucifix blessed with holy water was to be placed in the most active rooms. They're still there to this day as well. And he said that he felt that it was probably demonic, as they can masquerade themselves as somebody else in the beginning and they feed off of grief and stress and all that. He said that he could not do any sort of exorcism though, as the church had to go through an approval process for that. But he gave us holy water and agreed to bless our home. He also taught us how to bless the home ourselves for future reference. He, Tina and my mum, they went to the house to bless it. And room by room they went through performing this blessing. When they finished, they all went outside to the driveway. The priest left and my mum lit a cigarette to smoke with Tina. And that is when they claimed that an all-black dog came slowly walking out from behind our garage toward them. They said that it was nasty looking, beat up, gross hair, just the ugliest dog that you would ever see in your life, and it came toward them with teeth bared, growling and snarling at them. My mum claims that she felt like it was evil and screamed at it to go away and leave them alone, and that it was not welcome there. It ran off, and after that she never saw the dog again. That night, my mum says that she had the most realistic dream of her life. She was wrestling with some sort of a dark figure and was fighting with all she had. She was screaming at it to leave her and her kids alone, and then she woke up from her sleep completely exhausted and covered in sweat as if she was actually fighting something. And, weirdly enough, that was, well, just about the end of it. Polly's behavior just significantly improved, like overnight. The noises and the sightings, they all stopped. Everything went back to normal for a really long time. The last thing that happened though was in 2017 when I was packing up for college to go back home for the summer. My room was all packed up and I had started to feel a bit weird being alone in my dorm room. I didn't have any roommates, but I just didn't feel, well, alone. I contacted my mum and they said that they had also started hearing some things in the house again. On my last day of college, I had to run up to my dorm room to change my clothes really quick, and when I entered the room, I felt a really sort of heavy and negative energy. I sat down in a chair in my room, and immediately dazed out as if I was in the most intense daydream ever. The daydream was terrifying and was very violent, and it was regarding my little sister. I booked it out of that room immediately, though, and called my mum and told her. They re-blessed the house, and we haven't had any problems ever since then. Now, I know so many of you are going to probably say that this is all made up and it's fake, that maybe I've exaggerated things or something. If it was just my account of this experience, you know what, I might actually agree with you. But it's the fact that so many people around us experience things as well, that so many people were present for the same events, that it went on for so long. I have no doubt in my mind anymore that this is real. I honestly think that doubting it was giving it power, in fact. But since we have accepted what we went through and decided that we won't fear this thing or give it power over us, well, we've been fine ever since then. For those of you who will ask about the posts and the recordings and all that, my mum has never let me see them, so I just have no access. I've only got first-hand accounts, and also these were taken in like 2015 or 2016. I don't have the videos or the photos or anything, and they're from quite a long while ago now, so I don't even know where they are or if my mum knows where they are too. But ultimately, I hope that you all found our haunted house to be some sort of escape and entertainment, I guess. None of us believed in ghosts or demons or hauntings or whatever you want to call them, until we lived here. My mum claims that I too had weird experiences and sightings as a kid, and a few that I remember, but nothing ever like these. And we actually still live in that same house, so yeah, there it is. The story of our haunted house. A side note, or a fun fact I guess you could call it, that you might find interesting as well is that Mark's aunt and uncle owned the house that we lived in when he was a child. There were different owners between us, but after my mum and Mark started dating, we found out that Mark's aunt and uncle used to live there, and we learned a bunch of other history about the house, and the house still had some awesome things in it that Mark's uncle had originally built, like the bar in the basement, the built-in bookshelves, etc. Another weird side note too is that we redid my bedroom halfway through these experiences. When we pulled my bed out from the wall, there was this weird sort of devil cat stick figure drawing on the wall behind my bed. We never noticed it when we moved in somehow, but it was pretty big, like halfway up the wall I would say, and it took us 4 coats of paint to get it covered up. We would paint over it, and then the next day you could still see it a bit. That was always very weird. But the devil cat is just a blue wall now, and we confirm that Mark's family, they didn't paint the devil cat thing, so we have no idea how it got there. And that's it. That's the end. So, if anyone has any questions, then please do ask in the comments below, because I'm willing to answer anything. Ultimately, I hope you guys all stay safe out there, and I really hope for your sake that you never have to experience anything like we did. This happened around November of 2021 in Garner, North Carolina. North Carolina, being how it is when it comes to weather, it was a fairly warm night this night. I went to the neighborhood soccer field to go stargazing and to look at the full moon. The sky was clear and the moon was bright. It lit the field up nicely, in fact. After I set up my telescope, 20 minutes passed by with my back turned towards the neighborhood. I see a light dance to my left, so I turn around. A guard is doing their routine patrol and checking for intruders, so I think nothing of it and I turn my attention back to the stars. Then, I heard a noise that didn't sound human or like an animal. A deep guttural sound came from far behind me, and I turned to look again. It was the guard. It didn't feel right at all, and I turned back to start picking my stuff up. Then I hear footsteps getting closer, and the light was gone. "What a wonderful night, isn't it?" the voice asked. I turned to respond, but I noticed something off. The figure stood straight, like a soldier in the military, feet together and arms to his side. Yeah, it is," was all that I could muster out, then continued gathering my telescope and bag. "What's your name?" the guard asked. The way that he asked was unsettling. It sounded sort of layered, I guess, as if there was another voice speaking along with his, curious yet menacing. My name's Jackson," was all I responded with, giving a fake name. I turned to face him, and then I noticed why it seemed off. The figure was wearing a guard's uniform, but it looked worn and tattered. Its skin was black as a void, and I tried to look at its face with the moonlight, but there was nothing but a smile, a big menacing smile. "Nice to meet you, Jackson. My name's Mike," he said as he tilted his head to the side, revealing that there were no other features but that insidious smile. I began walking towards the neighborhood, but when I walked past him, my spine felt like it was turning into ice all of a sudden. And what followed made me terrified. It was the smell of sulfur. "Have a wonderful night, Jackson," was the last thing that I heard, and the act was slipping. The voice sounded inhuman, and even though I gave him a fake name, it made it worse. I walked far enough away to where I could still see the field and have a good distance away to see if he would return out from there, but he never did. So, a few months later, it was February, I was on a nightly walk and I stopped by the neighborhood office to visit the cat that resided there. While I was petting and playing with the little guy, a night guard stopped by to check on me to see if I was all right. I told him that I was and that I was visiting as the cat was in my lap, and before he walked away, I asked him if there was anyone named Mike that worked there back in November. He asked why, and I explained what had happened around that time, and then he promptly went to go and find me an answer. After a few more minutes, he came back out and looked confused. There was no one named Mike that worked there around that time in November, and he looked just as confused as I did, and maybe a bit more horrified considering that that was apparently his next area to check. We talked a bit more about how we both didn't like to mess with the paranormal, witchcraft, anything of the sort. Then we parted ways, leaving me more unnerved than I was prior. To this day, that night still freaks me out, sending bad chills down my spine whenever I remember the disturbing and sinister smile that pierced through that void that was its face. I was around 9 or 10 years old when my mum and I moved up north to the southwest of the UK. We just settled into our new home, and I was starting in a new school as well. On my very first day, we had an assembly. For anyone not from the UK, that's a morning gathering where the entire school meets in the hall to hear announcements from the teachers and all that sort of stuff. Nothing exciting, just them going on about, to be honest, I cannot even remember, but just random stuff. Anyway, one detail that always stood out to me, even then, was how close the school was to a major naval base, which was just down the road at about maybe 500 meters away. This particular base, it houses nuclear submarines and large naval vessels too. At the time, I didn't think too much of it, but now it definitely feels like it might be relevant. So I've always struggled with paying attention due to my ADD, attention deficit disorder, so naturally, my mind began to wander a bit. While the head teacher droned on, I found myself gazing through the tall windows of the assembly hall. It was around 9 in the morning, and the sky was a blanket of heavy grey clouds that day. And then, something strange happened. As the cloud cover began to shift and thin out in patches, I spotted something in the sky. It didn't move with the clouds. It didn't shift, flicker, or pass like a plane might. It just sort of sat there, motionless, in the break between the clouds. A large triangular object, dark and metallic. It definitely wasn't a trick of the light or a fleeting shadow or anything too. This thing had shape, 3 distinct points, clean edges, and a presence that felt, well, strange. My first thought as a kid was that maybe it was some kind of satellite or weird military equipment, but it seemed far too low, far too clear to be that. It wasn't suspended in space, it felt like it was right there, hovering above us, completely still while the sky moved around it. I remember blurting out something like, "Is that normal?" right in the middle of the assembly. The kid next to me nudged me and whispered for me to be quiet and pay attention. And when I looked back up, the clouds, they had rolled back in, thick and unbroken, and whatever I had seen was gone, just like that. Mind you, I didn't see it fly away, I didn't see it vanish in a flash. It was simply there one moment and then it just wasn't. It stuck with me ever since then, and I remember this all so vividly. Not just the shape or the silence, but the feeling that I'd seen something that I wasn't supposed to. I know it's easy to chalk it up to a child's imagination too, and you know what? Maybe that's all it was. But back then, I didn't know anything about UFOs or strange sightings like this. I had no frame of reference. I was just a bored kid in an assembly looking up at the sky. But I saw something, and I still think about it. This begins back when I was 15. Just for some background too, I work in a 5-star Michelin restaurant as a waitress in a sweet little area. We usually don't get anyone with bad intentions, usually just snobs really. Anyway, Easter Sunday of 2022, one of the busiest days of the year for us, a man, who will be known as the Easter Man, came in looking for a table for one. He was in a 3-piece suit with a carton of chicken eggs. He was sat in my section, so I go over to get a drink and food order. Once I got his order, he kept me talking, asking about my education, what I was doing in school, what my plans for the future were, what my hobbies were, my name, etc., etc. Just a little too much to be polite, but I let it slide. I was busy and tired, and I didn't want any trouble. Eventually, he left for the day, and quite honestly, I thought that was that. Now, for the next couple of months, he would come in 2 to 3 days every week. He got more confident too, attempting to flirt with me, asking me to come out with him after work. However, things got worse when one shift, I was walking him to his table and he slid his hands down my back and over my butt. I turned around and somehow politely told him not to touch me and do not push my boundaries, as I was only 15 and he knew that. After that, I didn't serve him that day. A week later he came in and I refused to serve him once again. My manager took over his table, and yet when everybody was on break and it was only me on the floor, he came inside. He knew by that point that it was table service only, and came up behind me, bringing his hands down on my arms. I was shaken up by that, but politely again told him not to touch me. And then after that, I didn't hear from him again until next Easter of 2023. Now, last Easter, things got worse. He showed up again, the usual shenanigans, yet my managers were prepped this year, not allowing me to go within the vicinity of him, keeping me safe. But this was only useful inside of work. You see, I walk through the town centre to get to work. It's about a 25-minute walk from the train station, and as I was walking to work one day, he saw me in his car and followed me into work. I immediately told my managers, who, yet again, told me to stay away from him. A week after that, I was having coffee before work, about a 15-minute walk away from my job, and what do you know? Guess who sees me and follows me on foot to work? I again tell my managers, who keep me away from him. Again, mind you. Yet that day was different. He asked my managers for me, saying that he knew that I was there because he'd seen me. Now, last year, in 2024, I took a lot of holidays around Easter time and was off for a lot of exams at that point. Supposedly, he came in a few times, asked for me, and he didn't come in much when I wasn't anywhere to be seen. He hasn't come in since then, however, and, well, this Sunday is Easter Sunday. So, wish me luck for Easter of 2025, because I dare say that I'm going to need it once again. This experience happened when I was 21, 5 years ago now. It's something that has played on my mind since, but I've never really talked about it. So, I went to dinner with a friend from university. Her name was Amy. We had one glass of red wine each with dinner, and I was staying at her house that night. So by the time that we got back, I was totally sober. Like I said, it was one glass of wine with dinner anyway. I never even felt tipsy. Amy was in her ensuite brushing her teeth at one stage, and I was laying in her double bed on my side, facing the bathroom that Amy was in, when all of a sudden I felt the very distinct feeling of a hand with long nails go down my back, from my neck to my bottom. It felt like a real hand as well. I could feel the long nails of all the fingers, and it tickled in the same way that a person's hand would. I spun around in shock and faced the other side of the bedroom, and for a split second, I saw a tall, middle-aged man facing me with his eyes boring into mine. It was the most uncomfortable, unnatural thing that I have ever felt. He was perfectly aligned with the far wall of the bedroom, and I saw him about 5 meters away, so no explanation for the human hand scratching down my back. I was suddenly crying and shouted for Amy, even though she was just next door, and I told her what happened. I was super emotional at this point, obviously, and then she started crying. I asked why, and she told me that she felt like somebody had been watching her from the corner of her room for months now. She even showed me text to her boyfriend where she had told him that she was struggling to sleep because she felt like she was just being watched all the time. Now, a well-known male serial killer, in London at least, that preyed on young women, used to live 2 doors down from Amy's house. I didn't know this as well until I looked it up afterward, trying to find information about this place. It's taken me years to process this because of just how real it was. I mean, I felt the hand scratch me. I saw the man right there, and this stuff is real. So I am an EMT as of writing this, but as this takes place, I was a student doing an ambulance ride-out with the local fire department. We have an hourly minimum as students to go and learn with them and take calls and all that. Now, on my official last day of ride-outs, I chose a Friday night shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. I live in a busy-ish, smaller city in Texas, so most of our calls at this station would occur later into the night. And so, as you can probably imagine, it was common for us to sit around waiting for nighttime. Now, I was taking notes for class when we got dispatched to an unknown status female under a bridge. This isn't unusual, as we have a big homeless population and callers will see them on the road and think that something is wrong. Often they'll just be drunk, or sometimes we have to give them something if they have OD'd or whatever. I was pretty excited. Not because of someone hurt, obviously, but because of the adrenaline rush. Walking out onto the scene, we were dispatched to a residence. It wasn't a house, but it was more a collection of tents intricately connected together under a big main highway road. Walking closer, the EMT, medic and I found who our patient was. Initially, she had her back turned toward us, and she was sitting down crisscross style, so we were unable to see what she was doing. But whatever she was doing, she looked very busy doing it, like she was soaring or doing something odd directly in front of her. She was sitting in a wet ditch, slightly away from her residence, and it smelled terrible, but I chalked it up to poor living conditions. We tried to get her to speak to us, and she cussed and shooed us away without turning around. Walking up, we finally realized what she had been doing. At first glance, I noticed her legs and feet. She had discolored ankles and feet in unnatural shades of purple, yellow, and green tones. Toward the toes, there was raw red flesh slowly bleeding and inflamed. I didn't recognize what she was holding at first, as I was too distracted by her feet. At this moment, my medic was talking to her, trying to comprehend what the heck was happening, and to get her to want transport, but she was trying to cut off her toes with a pair of kitchen scissors. She had completely degloved her toes, and we were also unable to find them on the scene. Now, despite the gruesome injury, she was not in pain, assumedly from the flesh necrotizing. She was also arguing my paramedic down, saying that she did not need to go to the hospital. It took about 30 minutes to get her to at least come inside the ambulance. Unfortunately, the medic and I, we were the unlucky ones to sit in the back with her while the EMT transported. Before transport, however, the smell was overwhelming, and my medic had to briefly step out and throw up before going en route. I'm still unsure why I didn't get sick. I mean, it was really bad. I do have a background in mortuary transport though, so a bonus from that job, I guess. With her on the stretcher and with better lighting, we were able to see the damage that she had done to her own feet. Now, the entire time she was arguing that she wouldn't need an amputation and that cutting her toes off and wrapping bandage around them to get rid of the gangrene would be enough. I looked at her injuries more closely and saw that there were bugs in her skin. Not big ones, but the movement was present, and that's how I noticed them. We didn't want to make her angrier than she was, so we didn't take any vitals or ask too many questions. The stench, though, was absolute insanity. Upon arrival to the hospital, an ED doctor that I had seen a few times during clinicals took over. The patient was very excitingly screaming about her removal of her toes directly into the doctor's face. We sprayed everything and wiped literally every surface of that ambulance with disinfectant. Directly after that, we left and got some food from Zaxby's. Also, I will mention too that the patient had a bunch of racist tattoos on her, and the day before the fire department had been out on her for a similar call before she hacked off her toes. She had been screaming racist profanities, slurs at one of the responding EMSs, and she apparently had an entire handle of Tito's to drink. And while I don't think that this is the scariest thing to ever happen to anyone, I was certainly very unnerved by the experience. Seeing as I'd only responded to car wrecks, DV, and medical issues so far, something like this was definitely unexpected. Sometimes too, I'll just randomly have images of her feet pop into my mind, and that is something that is very hard to live with. So I'm 27 and my mum is 49. We don't live together, but we stay close by generally. Her name is Linda. Now, we used to live in a small town for years, and during that time, my mum would have many occurrences where people in public would recognize her. She's a DoorDasher, so it would happen often at restaurants, but also pretty much everywhere else as well. At gas stations, getting a fountain drink and gas, at a Walmart, even at the post office. Whatever this thing is, it always makes an impression, where the people around her point out that it's her. They'll say things like, "Back again already, huh?" when going to get a drink at the convenience store, or, "Hey, I haven't seen you in a few weeks, how are you?" in a place that she's never been before. At the post office, the guy asked her if she was able to ship that package that she was having trouble with the other day. She hadn't been there in weeks. Sometimes they'll say things like, "Are you doing okay now? I hope your day is going better than it was earlier." At first you think that this was just coincidence, but it just happens way too often. My uncle and aunt had a sighting of the thing once. My uncle was talking to it and chatting up a storm, calling her by name and talking about the family. Apparently it just went along with it and chatted back, but my uncle nor my aunt is the type to lie about this stuff, so I really do believe them. After a while, my aunt came back up and asked my uncle who he was talking to, and he said, "I'm talking to Linda," in an obvious tone. My aunt said, "That's not Linda," and it just looked at her and then casually walked away. My aunt's description said that it looked like my mum, but not quite fully. Little features were off, and I know that it sounds cliche, but that's what she said. Just little features were off. Now, here's the weirdest part though. You could think that it was just someone in the town that looked like my mum, right? Well, we moved 9 hours away from that town recently, and after about 2 weeks, it's all started up again. Exact same thing. Random people referring to weird interactions towards my mum, acting like she was there earlier when she wasn't, talking about past conversations that they never even had. I have been present for some of these interactions too. One just happened today, in fact, which is why I thought that I should share this. Whatever it is, it seems to have followed her, and I don't know. What do you guys think that this is, and is there anything that we can do about it? In the summer of 2014, my then girlfriend and I got access to her brother's apartment. It was the year after we had both graduated, so we were still living at home with our parents. That's why we were excited to have a week with our own place where we could be alone. My brother had warned us that the apartment was haunted, not something that we paid too much attention to. Neither of us particularly were interested in anything paranormal, and I think we mostly just sort of laughed it off as a bit of a joke. I mean, we were just happy to have somewhere to crash when we came home late from seeing friends without disturbing our parents for once. Now, on the very first evening, while lying on the couch watching a movie, we heard something fall to the floor in the kitchen. When we went to go and check, there was a plastic cup, one that had been on the counter, lying in the middle of the floor, as if someone had forcefully knocked it off. We hadn't even been in the kitchen that evening since we had eaten out, so we just left the cup where it was and we kept watching the movie. The next day we got ready for another summer day and left the apartment right after breakfast, and when we came back in the late afternoon or evening and walked into the kitchen, there was another item on the floor, this time a large plastic gym shaker. We picked up both objects this time. We didn't really talk much about it, just noted that it did happen and it was weird. But that night is when things got truly eerie. So we went to bed in the bedroom and made sure that everything was closed like we normally did. The apartment was on the ground floor, and there was a fair amount of visibility from the outside, so we drew the curtains and shut all the windows, partly to keep out the traffic noise and partly so that no one could see in. Of course, that made the room very warm, and in the middle of the night, my girlfriend woke me up. We were both lying on our backs in bed when she told me to look up, and the ceiling lamp, which hung from a long cord, was spinning rapidly, as if someone had given it a powerful push to make it rotate in a perfect circle. I was awake now, but very tired. I remember staring at the lamp until it stopped spinning and then just sort of falling back asleep. The next morning, she told me that she had stayed awake the entire night because she was so shaken by it. I remember her being pretty rattled the next day, but we moved on quickly and we never really talked about it again. Our relationship didn't last past the fall, and 8 years later, in a completely different city, we went home together after running into each other by chance during a night out. I asked her if she remembered the lamp in the bedroom that summer, and she immediately burst out yes, and that it honestly terrified her. It's something that I'll never forget, and something that to this day I still cannot explain. For many years I've been thinking about this, and I still don't know if it was just my childhood imagination. So I used to tell my friends that I saw something in my house. Usually I'd say that it might have been a ghost, but honestly I genuinely have no idea. I cannot say exactly how old I was, but I was definitely still in primary school. That much I remember. It happened in the winter, in Poland, 2009 most likely. Probably a few days after Christmas Eve, because I was playing with a Lego set that I got as a gift. Now, it was already dark outside, the lights were on in my room, and I was playing on the carpet across from the door that opened onto a lit hallway, and from that angle looking out the door, I could see a wall and the banister around the space above the stairs. I was really focused on playing, my eyes were down, but for some reason, maybe because I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, I looked up and glanced towards the door. That's when I saw it. From the left side of the doorframe, a figure slowly started to emerge. It must have been over a meter tall, but no taller than 1.5 meters. It had a strange color, but not so much the figure itself, more like an aura surrounding it. Kind of a mix between purple and celadon. It was floating in the air, maybe 0.5 meter off the ground, hard to say exactly. I was just a kid sitting on the floor after all, so I had to look up slightly. It had bent legs and a bit of a hunch, and in that position it slowly drifted to the right through the air. I don't remember what it was wearing exactly, but I know that it had clothes, purple for sure, pants and black leather shoes. It looked like a formal outfit almost, and it appeared to be male. I remember that it had a fairly large head, so big it looked disproportionate to the rest of its body, with a black mop of hair and big ears. The facial features were hard to tell. I saw it from the profile. Definitely very prominent cheekbones though, and a big nose. I froze for about 3 seconds though. I couldn't move. I was in shock. Then a wave of chills hit me and fear took over. I immediately looked down at the Lego bricks and started pretending to play. In my head I was thinking, just pretend you're playing and maybe it won't notice you. Pretend that you didn't see it. But after a few seconds, I couldn't process what I had just seen, or even whether I had seen something, or if it was just my imagination. And quite honestly, I might have believed it was all in my head to this day, if not for what happened next. Curiosity won out, and I looked up again, without lifting my head too much because I was afraid that it might still be there. And then, I saw from that side of the doorframe, part of the figure was still visible. After a short moment, it then completely moved out of view. I was stunned and terrified. I sat there for a while, trying to gather the courage to run to my parents, who were in the living room downstairs. When I finally managed to do it, I ran out of that room not looking to the right out of fear that it was still there, bolted down the stairs, and sat on the couch next to my parents. I never said a word to them. I just took comfort in the feeling of safety, and I was scared that they wouldn't take me seriously. I didn't have the strength to try and explain to them because the emotions that I had just gone through had completely drained me. That thing, whatever it was, it never even looked at me though. It was like it didn't even know that I had seen it. I never told any of my friends at school either, as I didn't want to be laughed at. For the next few days, I felt uneasy any time I played in that room though, afraid that I'd see it again. It took years before I told anyone, usually after a few drinks, and only in vague terms, just saying that I'd seen something that I couldn't explain, without ever going into detail, as I didn't want to seem like a complete weirdo. But that's why I'm here. Has anyone else ever encountered something like this? Was it just my imagination, do you think? What keeps bothering me, though, is that when I looked again, it was still there. If it weren't for that second glance, I wouldn't even think twice about this, and would have assumed that it was just my imagination. But because of that second glance, I really don't think it was. This happened when I was a kid. My parents and I had moved to this apartment complex back in 1986 that was built in the 40s during World War II. The basement had a fallout shelter installed, and in the fallout shelter, there were gas masks, tins of old food, old World War II posters of enlisting. I was about 2 years old at the time that we moved in, so I didn't really understand or comprehend all of this, but I didn't start to have experiences until I was about maybe 5 years old. Some experiences involved my toys going on by themselves, dolls in spots that I didn't leave them, my radio turning off and on, to which my parents' explanation was that I was doing it, but didn't remember, or that it was just my imagination. But that all changed one night. Now, I had 2 windows on the side of my bed. This is relevant too. The right one would open and stay open with no problem, but the left one was always broken and a bit weird. It just wouldn't stay open, and we would have to stick a board in the window for it to remain open. Now, one night I had woken up to this loud bang which scared me half to death, causing me to sit straight up in bed. As I'm sitting there, my eyes trying to adjust to the room, looking around to see if something may have fallen, and if so, where. That's when I heard it again, another huge bang. It was on the side of me, so I look over in the direction to see what it could have been, but didn't see anything that could have made that noise. That is, until I see the left window, the window that needs a board to stay open, slowly opening up, and opening by itself. I sat there frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, if I was actually seeing what I was seeing. I couldn't do anything but sit there in disbelief and attempt to close my eyes tightly for 10 seconds because 5-year-old me, this was just a bad dream, and closing my eyes tightly is what I would always do to end a bad dream. I still do this to this day, to be honest. As soon as my eyes opened, I see the window fully open and then slam again. I realized at that moment that I was fully awake, and then the window starts to open again. Only this time it's opening a little faster than last time, and same as last time, it would open all the way and then slam shut. It happened again and again and again, each time opening a little faster than the last time and slamming shut. It was as if someone was opening it fully and letting it go in order to slam shut. But then the window flies all the way up and stays open. Then I hear the most horrible, evil, sadistic laugh, like a cackle right in front of me. Well, that was enough for me to finally move. I fly off the bed, getting tangled in my sheets and comforter. I managed to get the comforter off of me, but I still have the sheets wrapped around me. But that didn't stop me from hauling butt all the way to my parents' bedroom, screaming bloody murder as I did. My screaming ended up waking up my parents, so they were already awake when I got to their bedroom. I'm trying to explain to them what had just happened, what I had seen, and told them about the cackling and all that. My mother was the comforting parent, and was trying to calm me down as best as she could, telling me that I just had a really bad nightmare and that my nightmare continued when I was semi-awake because I was half asleep awake. I was persistent though, and kept repeating myself over and over and over, telling them about the window opening and shutting by itself, and the cackling again and again. My father, who was the no-nonsense parent, was extremely upset that I had woken him up and said, "Enough, it was just a bad dream. Come on, I'll show you. There's nothing in your room to be afraid of. And your mother's right. You probably just dreamed the whole thing. So come on, let's go." My father and I head back to my bedroom. My little hand clenching his hand tightly, we go into my room. My comforter is still on the floor. My father goes to pick it up, and when he does, he glances over at the windows and sees that the left window is still open, wide open in fact. Nothing in it to hold it, just wide open, which, knowing this window, should be completely impossible. My father goes over to the window, looks at it, then back at me and says, "Did you open this?" I tell him, desperately trying to get him to believe me, "No, Dad, I told you. It kept opening and slamming by itself." My father, frustrated, cranky, and highly annoyed at this point, tells me windows don't open by themselves. It probably got stuck when you opened it. My father reaches over to make sure that I didn't stick anything in the window to keep it open, and as soon as he stuck his hand in and was about to pull his hand away, the window slams shut, nicking his hand in the process from pulling it out of the window. My father, who was still trying to make sense of this situation, was suddenly spooked and creeped out. I then spent the night in my parents' room in my sleeping bag on their bedroom floor that night. After that night, the activity seemed to amplify. Other stories for another time. It's been almost 40 years and I still have nightmares about that night. The window opening and shutting, the cackling, the fear, and my little 5-year-old heart pounding in my chest. It is hands down one of the worst experiences that I've ever had. Until I encountered the Hat Man, that is. Which, again, is another story for another time. In 2008, I was a sophomore in high school. The first day of school, I was sitting in my English class when this kid, whom I had never seen before, entered the class 10 minutes late. His name was Mike. The teacher asked why he was late, and Mike responded with, "Sorry, Teach, I spilled strawberry daiquiri all over my shirt and had to change it." Mike was a bit of a class clown who was more trouble than funny, to be honest. He was the type of guy who believed he could do whatever he wanted and there would be no repercussions. For example, one day in English, the teacher was late getting to class, and well, Mike said that since the teacher was 10 minutes late, legally we were allowed to leave, and so he did so. Later, he was shocked when he ended up in detention after school for skipping class. But Mike and his friends were the group that would sit in the parking lot at lunch and rev the engines of their Subarus and act like they were in Tokyo Drift or something. I remember that Mike played football that year and was livid that the coach didn't make him the starting quarterback, despite him not being all that impressive as an athlete. However, the thing that I remember the most about Mike was that he always wore this white baseball cap backwards and turned to the side, which was the style at that time. Well, the next year, my junior year, Mike just never showed up to school. Word was that he had been drinking with a group of friends near a fishing spot by the local river when he just disappeared. The rumors also started, and one was that he got into a fight with another guy who hit him in the head with a beer bottle. According to the rumor, Mike fell into the river and was swept away. Other people said that it was his brother who had pushed him into the river. One guy in particular claimed that he had hit Mike and pushed him into the river. Regardless of the truth, Mike was never found. He had a full-page memorial in the yearbook and everything. After that year, though, nobody ever really mentioned Mike again. As time went by, the only time that he would be mentioned were when some friends and I would meet up and somebody would say, "Who was that kid who disappeared again?" And the story would be told. Almost 15 years after Mike went missing, though, I met a guy who was a retired detective for the sheriff's department. His name was Jim. Well, it turns out that Jim was the one that investigated Mike's disappearance. When I mentioned the rumors about him getting hit with a beer bottle, he said, "Yeah, we heard those rumors too, but they just never panned out." Jim told me that the day that Mike went missing, he was out by the fishing spot with anywhere between 5 to 10 other teenagers. Mike had paid a homeless guy to buy a beer from the local store, so he and his friends could party out there. Afterwards, they drove way out to the fishing spot, 30 to 40 miles out of town. And Jim said that, more than likely, Mike was drunk and fell into the river and just was swept away. They never did find the body, which Jim said was probably in the Gulf of Mexico by now. Jim asked what kind of student Mike was in school. I told Jim that I thought Mike was an entitled class clown, to be honest. Jim wasn't surprised. Everybody else told him what a great student that he was, which he said isn't surprising with missing persons cases. Jim said that nobody wants to be the person who spoke poorly of the guy. He also said that he got the same feeling about Mike's parents. Dad came across as a bully who peaked in school, and Mum was the homecoming queen sort of deal. People who just never really moved on past that point, I guess. People who may have encouraged Mike's behavior, telling him about all the fun that they had had in their high school days. Well, a year or so later, I was out fishing by that spot at some point. I had gotten there late in the afternoon, and by the time that I was ready to leave, the sun had already gone down behind the hills. It was light enough that you could still see, but dark enough that you need your headlights when driving for sure. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed that I was the only one in the parking area, so I put my fishing gear in the bed and climbed into the driver's seat. As I backed my truck up, the headlights illuminated a cluster of trees in front of me. And that was when I saw the white hat against the dark backdrop of the woods. Thinking that somebody may have just left a lost hat hanging in the trees, which is common practice for lost gear, I flipped on my high beams to see if anything else was in the trees. And when I did, standing in the trees was a person that I recognized but couldn't place immediately. The figure was wearing the white hat and staring at me. After a few seconds of staring at him, trying to place where I knew this guy from, it clicked. It was Mike. He looked exactly the same that he did as that day that he claimed to have spilled his cocktail on his shirt. Almost immediately I realized who I was looking at. Mike then turned and walked into the forest. I then put my truck into gear and I noped out of there as fast as I could. I also haven't been back to that fishing spot since then, and I definitely do not plan on going back after sundown. I eventually asked a couple of guys that I know who fish out there if they've ever seen anything strange out there, but nobody ever had. I really don't know if I saw Mike because I knew him or if there was another reason, but I will never forget that white hat that he would wear all the time. This is a bit of a long one, so do get comfy. Now, when I lived in Minnesota, I saw something that's troubled me for years now, and still does. You see, I had about 2 weeks until my plane ride, moving to PNW. I had no money and no one to stay with, so me and my dog roughed it and camped out in the woods. It was middle of November 2022, and temperatures were 22 low and around 35 to 38 high. In other words, always had a fire going. It honestly wasn't that bad, except at night when the fire would go out. My dog would either stay in the tent or tied up next to me. We must have spent only about 6 days in that area, and every single day I saw massive deers. I had just moved from Memphis, where I bagged my first one. The deer in Minnesota were jaw-droppingly huge compared to my 10-pointer. Sometimes they would be about 100 yards away, walking or running across some train tracks. The woods were thick, but I could always make out animals. Before night, I would always see a dog, sometimes even two, looking at me and very slowly approaching. I always screamed and hollered when I noticed them. On the second night that I was there, I heard crashing through the woods and rocks near the tracks as well. I stepped out of my tent, and I would see about 10 or so deer running down the tracks and then blindly dart back directly towards me. I figured that I'll see or smell fire too, so I just sort of stood there and was just in awe of nature. But they weren't really veering off. The trees were huge and the woods were thick, and they were running and jumping so fast and far that I would feel the ground shake. The two leading deer, they came within 10 feet of me easily, and honestly, I was petrified. I genuinely thought that I was about to be pierced or something, but as soon as I stepped my leg over to dive into the tent, they turned 90 degrees and just jumped, running away. I thought that it was extremely scary, but also very cool to be honest, and I was glad for the experience. Now, at about 10 p.m., I'm stoking the fire and I noticed something off in the distance on my side of the tracks. Not even towards the tracks, but parallel with me. It looked like two people with headlamps on, processing a deer. On my first day there, I did see and quickly talk to a guy passing by, saying that he was looking for deer skins. I made nothing of it, and stopped shining my light towards them. After failing to fall asleep, I stepped outside and the two headlamps were still on, same spot and making the same motions. It looked like they were maybe about 5 or maybe 4 feet apart. One would fiddle with something on the ground and hand it over to the other. At this point, I was alarmed because, it's now 1 in the morning. I shine my light, watch very intently. It was so dark and so far away that by that time my eyes would focus and I would need to blink, but I would always lose what I was seeing. I would watch one headlamp and see that headlamp split into 2. So I knew that what I was looking at was a pair of eyes now. 2 individual sets of eyes. They were behind fallen logs and a standing tree. The motions that I saw were that of them moving back and forth, peeking around different spots of the trees and log. I moved my head side to side and they did the same, but on different sections and heights of the tree, like they were crouching and then sort of standing, but never looking away from me. When I got back into my tent, I zipped up the door, leaving the top open about an inch or 2. I zoomed my flashlight in, peeking through the hole, and I could see when they stopped and when they started this motion back up. The harder that I tried to focus, the more agitated the movement seemed. I was getting on a plane soon, so all I had were knives and a couple of flares, kept them close and snuggled up with my dog. Around 5 in the morning, I peeked through my tent and was still being watched. When the sun came out, I stepped out, and when I did, nothing was there. I figured that they were wolves, but I don't know, the motion and the mimicking of mine was pretty insane. I had a great spot though, and I worked hard on cleaning this area up, so I thought that I'd stay there at least another night, not trying to psych myself out over, well, nothing really. Now, on night 3 I never did see them again, but it was around midnight when I heard crashing through the tracks again, and thought that it was the herd of deer. Following it with my flashlight, I noticed that it was only one animal, moving way faster too. It did the same thing the deer did before, and started running directly towards me. I could hear it leaving the rocks and running through a large patch of tall grass, like really tall, around 4 feet, dead grass, pretty loud. It's still coming towards me, and I'm shining my light in the general area it's about to pop out of, about 40 feet in front of me, I would guess. The instant it came out, It takes like maximum 2 steps and stands right up and stops instantly. But 1 second it's not seen at all, and the next second I'm staring at this thing, and true flight or fight finally kicks in. I immediately knew that there was no outrunning this thing. I knew that it was a full-on predator, and I knew that if I did run, that I would get chased. The eyes were forward-facing, very long, pointy ears, and could go on all fours or two. My dog was zipped up in the tent 3 feet from me. I zoomed in with my flashlight, and it helped absolutely nothing. I could see amberish eyeshine and a wet gloss on the nose. Staying perfectly still with my light on it, I slowly but deeply took in a huge breath. About 10 seconds has gone by, maximum, since it stood up, and I screamed as loud as I could, but also as quickly as I could. All I screamed was "hey," and I never sounded like that before. I've never ever screamed like that in my life. Didn't even know that I could sound like that. It wasn't recognizable. At the same time that I screamed, though, I unintentionally blinked. I heard a thud and the dead grass rustle, but not nearly enough for it to actually be gone. I knew that whatever it was definitely within 3 to 5 feet of the grass line. I continued to yell out that I was going to mess it up and I was going to eat it repeatedly. Before my initial scream, I saw this thing about 7 feet at the tips of the ears. The ears were 100% the same shapes as Anubis as well, if you've ever seen that. Stupidly long and pointy, very pointy. Well, after not hearing anything for quite some time, I just decided that I would take my chances and head back into my tent, and I just stayed there all night, awake and trying to figure out what to do. Thankfully, I made it through the night, and the next morning I walked out into town and went to Caribou Coffee for some Wi-Fi. First thing I did when my phone turned on, I needed to charge, was I searched up images of Anubis. And quite honestly, I started crying silently right there in the store, staring at this picture. I contacted my family in PNW to get a new plane ticket for an earlier arrival. My 2 weeks had now turned into 1. Getting back to camp, I started packing everything up to relocate my camping spot. This was a mistake though, because that giant thing that I saw, I totally forgot about the 2 things that I saw on night 2. So I grabbed my things and I walked right past that spot, the trees that I saw them at. I went about half a mile further, into more of the denser part of the woods, thinner trees but denser. That night, night 4, was terrifying too. This was the first night that I'd heard yipping from a pack of coyotes. This was about an hour before the sun went down, and it sounded like a person screaming, but it went on for so long and so loudly that I knew that it wasn't a person. They all started at the same time, and it went on for so much longer than I expected, probably around a minute I would say. Very far away, but still made me turn my head at first. About an hour after the sun went down, that's when I heard wolves howling. That definitely made me pucker up a little bit. More chills, and I decided to make a large fire, or at least throw some logs on it. Fewer trips outside in the night and all that. When doing this, I see that the 2 pairs of eyes are back and they're watching me. Again, I kept being loud and screaming that I was going to eat you and all this, along with other things. The next night, though, it only got worse. Every single night after that, too, just got worse and worse. First night at this new location, the 2 pairs of eyes come back. The second night was 6 pairs, and the next 8. All of them were at a distance, but very, very still. They stood in the exact same spot every night that they returned, with the main 2 mimicking my motions, peeking around trees for a better view it seemed. I even saw them vigorously bobbing up and down like a monkey would when I unzipped my tent. When it was finally time to leave, I quickly packed up what I could bring and I left everything not allowed on the flight behind in my tent, not even really caring anymore